Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I loved living in Alaska and being swathed by the comforting blankets of the natural world that swaddled me in her warm embrace, especially during the summer months. Alaska in spring and summer is postcard perfect, and the fine weather is ideal at this time of year. When summer arrives, so do all the bountiful opportunities for the locals and visitors to our part of the world alike, where you can enjoy the benefits of hiking, camping, fishing, sailing, and so much more, doing almost anything that tickles your fancy. In truth, I love Alaska all year round, as her dramatically theatrical seasonal changes can be very exciting, and a snow-covered Alaska is a picturesque wonderland. The gleaming white carpets of snow upholster everything without restraint, and anything the icy fingers of winter touches turns magically white. Let's not kid. To the naked eye, a white world can be spectacularly beautiful, but as is often the case, with every rose comes a nasty thorn. There are times the treacherously guileful cold weather can be your very worst enemy. It can be cruel and merciless, especially when the winter wind whips up the snow and it panels audaciously against your face, and icicles form on your lips and eyelashes, while your fingers and toes feel like frozen bullets that could so easily drop off. I have had frostbite twice in my life, so I know all about that. I also know a plethora of extraordinary confounding stories of people who enigmatically went missing in one of our uncongenial icy winter blizzards, never to be seen or heard from again. These tales are regretfully more commonplace than many would care to admit. Most Alaskans are aware that many people go missing from our part of the world every single year, especially within the Alaskan Triangle. It seems to go with the territory of living in an isolated wilderness, where unexplainable serendipitous things are just bound to happen. It's the not knowing what became of so many of these missing persons that bothers so many of us, when a person just mysteriously vanishes off the face of the earth without any plausible explanation. It certainly does raise more than a few incredulous eyebrows and gets the garrulous tongues in town wagging fiercely. Sometimes people see the missing person only seconds before they disappear. Then moments later they just vanish, almost as if they were swallowed up by the snow itself in one enormous big hungry mouthful. Ostensibly, rumours abound that are as diverse and as seemingly colourful as a packet of minstrels as to what could have become of them. There are some people living here that are so practical, so rational, that they believe the missing person was more than likely killed by a wild animal, or slipped through the ice on a lake, and ended up freezing to death, being consumed by a cruel watery grave. While there are others, much like myself, that know unequivocally that some of the most outrageous things can happen out here, that those armed with a sceptical outlook would never ever believe in a million months of Sundays was plausible. My father used to say, that those were the most naive, fleeceable people of all, who were not open to the fact that this world is not what it may seem. "They think they know it all," he would say, shrugging his shoulders sadly, as if commiserating with their callow ignorance. "They think that what you see is what you get. But they cannot see beyond the veil, the things in plain sight that only a discerning, astute eye will observe. They listen attentively to their geography and history masters, who tell them that this is all there is. They soak it all up, like a dupable, happy sponge, refusing to even conceive that they don't know it all. Of course, it's the intellectuals, the unsuspecting university professors, who are the most biased of all, caught up in the sticky silken web of their self-delusion. Their nescient minds are tightly closed to anything that does not fit their perfect paradigm-like bubble of the world. They discard anything that does not complement their belief system, spitting it out. I almost feel sorry for them, for it must be pretty miserable to believe that this is all there is. When your jejune mind is closed like that, there is no room for expansion, enlightenment, or the entertainment of much excitement or wondrous awe. For if you lock yourself up in a tight little matchbox and refuse to see beyond it, you're going to be as blind as a bat, and your little world you inhabit is going to be exactly as you expect it to be, like the food you order on the menu at the local tapas bar, predictable and unsurprising, unless, of course, the chef messes up your order. Suffice to say, most people know that Alaska is a magnet for strange, ambiguous, rather baffling events. I know people here who remain tight-lipped about some of their weird, outlandish experiences that have crossed their path, that they don't care to talk about. I doubt they ever will, lest they should be considered as nutty as a fruitcake. By all accounts, when something really wacko happens to you, and by wacko, I mean just that, wacko, it's easy to question your own sanity, to scratch your head doubtfully, and to say, did that really happen? It might not take long to persuade yourself that you must have been dreaming, for sometimes digesting what you know really did happen to you is like a big pill to have to swallow that gets stuck up in the back of your throat and simply will not go down, no matter how much you try to push it. You don't want to accept or believe it actually happened to you, even though it did. In a nutshell, if you can't believe what happened to you, how are you ever going to get anybody else to believe your account? I certainly get where people are coming from in this regard. I fully comprehend their desire to go to their graves, clutching their secrets tightly to their sides, like purses they don't want to be parted from, so that their secret will inevitably remain buried with them. I think it's a pity people don't talk, regardless what others may think of their accounts. But there you go. Each to his own, as my father always used to say. He was quite the philosopher, my dad. Over my lifetime living in Alaska as a highly inquisitive young boy, who always was looking for answers to my many questions, that I was to experience bizarre, paradoxical, illogical events that I could not explain, and many of them I might add. When strange things happened to me as a kid, I was much more accepting of the idiosyncratic and bizarre, possibly because my childlike imagination was open to Aslan, the talking lion in Narnia, and the talking beavers in the illustrious children's book, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, whom they encountered when they slipped into a world, much like a snow-covered Alaska, beyond their wardrobe. I used to think if it can happen to them, it could happen to me, and it seems I wasn't wrong. I grew up in a wooden cabin, about half an hour's drive from Fairbanks, although to my young eyes my ordinary home was a palace to me. I loved and appreciated every wooden beam that had been laid down by my father so lovingly to create our home. He built our cabin from scratch, from top to bottom, without any help, and I knew the love that had gone into its construction from every nail in the wood, and marvelled at my father's hard work, which made our wooden cabin all the more special to me. My creative mother did her best to make it as snug as a bug. She bought fabulous furnishings from Fairbanks, and all kinds of eclectic knickknacks that she found at local stores, My mother had an eye for the unusual, but I will say this about her. She had a great sense of style. She easily transformed our cabin into a sumptuous den. It was always the best feeling in the entire world to spend a morning out in the snow, riding our snowmobiles, to return to a warm cabin with a crackling fire in the hearth and the delicious smell of home-baked bread wafting all over the cabin. In those days, I didn't know much about life in a big city. I had never visited a large, booming, spirited, lively metropolis like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, or Boston. And if I had, I think I would have appreciated all the more the idyllic sanctuary I was privileged to call my home. When I did visit New York for the first time in my life, while I welcomed the exciting buzz of a vibrant, electrifying city, the roar of the traffic, the honking taxicabs, the mixed tangle of people rushing to work every day, I found more than a little daunting. I knew from thenceforth that the stimulating life in a big city was not for me. It was pleasant to spend time in a booming metropolis, but it was better still to return to the peaceful sanctuary of our idyllic home life in Alaska, where the only traffic you might hear is the roaring wind, and the only honking sounds that did not come from yellow taxicabs, but wild Canada geese, crows or barred owls. Growing up, I had an older sister called Tabitha, but unfortunately she didn't survive past the age of 8. One day she went running across a frozen lake. The ice gave way to her, swallowing her up in a single freezing mouthful, like a hungry whale. My father tried to unavailingly rescue her, but when he ran across the lake after her, the ice began to heave and groan and break apart precariously, and my father very nearly ended up under the lake himself, in a watery grave. My desperate father had fruitlessly tried to get reinforcements to help Tabitha out, but by the time her body was removed from the lake, she was dead. She looked like a bedraggled rag doll. My parents had told her not to run over the lake, as some parts of it might not have been frozen solid yet, but my stubborn sister had a selective memory. She swore she'd seen a little white kitten on the ice that she needed to rescue. "Look, Mummy, white kitty," she said, scampering across the lake. "White kitty! I need to save the white kitty!" "Come back," my mother shouted. "Come back at once, Tabitha! It's not safe! The lake isn't all frozen!" But my sister did not listen. All she could think about was rescuing that kitten. Nothing else mattered to her, as my sister adored animals. Before my parents could stop her, she was autominously gone like lightning, racing across the lake, searching frantically for the white little kitten, calling out desperately, "Kitty! Kitty! Kitty!" oblivious to the danger she was in, and deaf to the urgent, persistent calls of my parents. They screamed, "Come back, Tabitha! There's no kitten there!" My father, who was not inclined to be angry, became belligerent, calling out to her, "Come back at once, Tabitha! Come on!" in his no-nonsense stern voice that usually got our attention, as it was rare for him to speak to us with an abrasive, commanding tongue. But my contrary sister just refused to listen, and then in our horror we watched her go plunging through the ice like a bullet, searing through bone and sinew. Of course, my family was devastated and lugubriously sorrowful over my sister's fortuitous passing. We never saw the kitten my sister claimed to have seen that day on the ice, and were sure she'd imagined it. But 2 days after her death, that was when we discovered a white kitten lying on our front doorstep, meowing to be let into our cabin. We brought her in, giving her the name Tabby, after my sister Tabitha. My mother believed Tabitha had sent us the white kitten. Maybe this was the white kitten she had seen on the ice, or the arrival of Tabby on our doorstep was just a mere coincidence. We couldn't be sure. My mother wept about Tabitha's unfortunate passing for several days, but then she and my father picked up the pieces of their lives and did not look back. I admired how stoically resilient they both were. My intrepidly tenacious parents had such a healthy, stout-hearted attitude towards death. My mother always used to say that when someone was gone, they were gone. There was no point living life in sorrow, as you can't change a thing. Your tears were not going to bring back the withered flower that died on you. I always tell myself, "We'll see Tabitha one day," she told me, so I refused to be sad. Tabitha wouldn't want us to be sad, would she? And besides, wherever she is, she'll be having a great time. If she was to see us crying, she'd be less inclined to be enjoying herself. She'd be commiserating with our grief, and I wouldn't want to do that to her. I became acquainted with death in Alaska, more than I would have been had I lived anywhere else in the world. I became aware that this is part of the natural rhythm of life and the flow of everything. We are born, we live, and ultimately we die. None of us escape that harmonious flow. It'll happen to us all. I have seen old animals drop down dead in freezing conditions, when their bodies just packed up and decided enough was enough. Even a bird dropping out of a tree, lying there dead, or animals who didn't survive the winter hibernation. So yes, I am very familiar with death. In the end, it was me, my mother and my father and my grandfather Otis that made up my family. And for me, my grandfather was like a daddy senior, and my father was like my daddy junior. And I considered myself the luckiest boy in the world to live with two daddies. One day in early spring, I woke up excited to embrace the day. It was so beautiful. I bounced out of my bed with unbridled enthusiasm, like an excitable dog. I could feel 3 solid lumps on my bed weighing me down. I looked up to see our 3 cats, Tabby, Roly-Poly, and Spotted Dick, all curled up together in a round ball. The latter both possess names after famous English puddings that I've personally tasted when I visited England once. They're delicious, I have to say. They say things are bigger in Alaska, and they're not wrong about that. Roly-Poly was an enormous cat, but she carried her weight rather well. My mother put her on a diet once, and her waistline only expanded after turning her attention to the rat population, when she decided that diet kibble just wasn't for her. So my mother promptly decided that putting Roly-Poly on a diet wasn't going to work. The rats were making her fatter than ever. The vet did not believe my mother when he claimed that she was clearly sneaking Roly-Poly some secret snacks, as our cat had willfully packed on still more weight. My mother protested her innocence. "I promise you, Doc, I've been giving Roly-Poly her diet kibble, but she hasn't been eating it." "Well, with the greatest of respect, Mrs. Feinstein, Roly-Poly hasn't packed on more pounds from eating just fresh air, has she? Someone's clearly been feeding her," he had chided, thinking presumptuously that he knew it all. We were soon to discover a stack of rat bones on the corner of our cabin, several dozen rats' tails and decapitated rats' heads, all clustered together in an unsightly heap. Then we discovered the offender of these macabre murders, Roly-Poly, who was lying on the ground, chowing through a big rat, as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. She had mutinously declared war on the diet kibble, and she had won the long-drawn-out battle. My mother said, "Right, that's it. No cat of mine is living on rats." So she threw out the diet kibble in disgust, and Roly-Poly gladly returned to her original diet. So soon the decapitated heads and the rats' tails became a thing of the past. Spotted Dick was a cat with unusual spotted markings on him, hence his name, and growing up these 3 cats were very special to me. We also had a large greyhound called Sophie, and she was the gentlest giant you've ever seen. She was the most easygoing character, and chilled like my father. They both had such a gentle energy. It was hardly a wonder that Sophie bonded with my father, and attached herself to him like superglue. They were like 2 peas in a pod. Sophie followed my father everywhere he went, and even accompanied him to town on the back of his truck. When I used to watch Sophie running across the snow, she looked like a silvery ghost. It was quite transfixing to watch her, especially in winter. She looked quite spectral at times. So let's get back to my story. I woke up on a day that was typically like any other day. I was not expecting anything out of the ordinary or untoward to happen. The day didn't seem to be clandestinely hiding a secret from me. In truth, the day was dressed in its customary apparel, and seemed as honest and as forthcoming as it always was. The trees weren't whispering in the breeze, and there was nothing deceitful about the pretty bird song that I could hear from outside my bedroom window. I was excited getting out of bed, as springtime meant I could go exploring, and my father had said we could go fishing in the morning. Better still, Grandpa Otis would come along for the adventure, as he enjoyed a spot of fishing. Let's just say, back in the prime of his life, he had been quite the fisherman. He had taught my father everything he knows about fishing, who in turn had taught me. The previous night my grandfather Otis had been expressing his desire to go fishing. "It's been a long, drawn-out winter. My old bones didn't take it too good this year, I'm afraid. These winters can be something tough, they can. With springtime here, I fancy a spot of sun shining down on my old face, sitting there on the fishing pier again, with an icy cold beer in my hands while I fish. There ain't nothing better than that, let me tell you. I mean, who says you need to meditate when you go fishing? That's what it's all about, ain't it? Relaxing, breathing in the fresh air, and grabbing a big old fish for the ride." My father had thoroughly agreed with him. "Well, that's settled then. The three of us will set off for the lake in the morning. We will be back before lunch. Hopefully we can grace your frying pan with our freshly caught fish," he said to my mother, with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. My mother murmured, "Now that would be nice, very nice. We haven't had freshly caught fish for a while." No one said anything, but you could hear the sound of everybody's stomachs grumbling in eager anticipation. As freshly caught fish, my father would always say, "There ain't anything quite like it. Touch of pepper and salt, melted butter, garlic and lemon, and you've got a feast fit for a king." I remember a soft sunlight was filtering through the cabin window, washing everything in a congenial radiance, as we sat down to enjoy a not-so-hearty breakfast. I say that as we used to start our days with only a light snack. The kitchen was always lovely and warm, as we had an oil-fired oven in there, one of those cast-iron old-fashioned numbers that kept the cabin cosy during the winter months, most especially. I don't think you can buy an oven like that anymore. It's probably obsolete and belongs more in an antique store, but it worked just fine when I was a boy, and if I saw one again, I'd buy it in a heartbeat. Some of those old stoves, they were the absolute best. "Are you ready to go fishing, George?" my father had said to me when I entered the kitchen, wearing my long khaki shorts, my long socks and flannel top, along with a broad grin on my face. I couldn't help it. I was so excited. The idea of a morning fishing session with my father and Grandpa Otis was just perfect. It didn't get better than this. I could feel my heart fluttering with ebullient anticipation, as if thousands of butterflies were flapping inside me. I visualized myself with an enormous fish at the end of the line. How I had dreamed about that once-in-a-lifetime king-sized catch. My mother had told me when I caught my first enormous fish, she would proudly blow the photograph of me up, holding my massive conquest, and hang it pride of place on the wall, next to the pictures of my dad and Grandpa Otis with their fishing trophies. My father had caught a massive 95-pound sturgeon once. There was a picture of him holding the fish, and a similar picture of my grandfather with a huge 120-pound halibut. I also wanted to be on that Hall of Fame. "Wait until you catch your first monster fish," Grandfather Otis would tell me. "You will swell with pride, young man, and I mean literally swell." I wasn't sure what he meant. I didn't like the idea of swelling. I hope it didn't mean I'd grow a big belly, like some of the men that frequented the town bar, whose tummies all looked terribly swollen. I watched my father smothering his toast with butter and jam, and knocking it all back with a hot cup of coffee. "It's a fine day for fishing," my dad had said. "We're going to enjoy it out there this morning. The weather is just fine today." My grandfather entered the room with an incredulous look on his face. I could see he was dressed for fishing, in his long khaki shorts and matching cotton top, but there was something about his demeanour that gave me pause for thought. He looked as if he was hiding words on his lips that he was reluctant to share, words that did not smell sweet like a fragrant breeze, but ominous words that ponged like a bad smell. My grandfather looked good for his years in terms of his body. Indeed, if I was his age, I would be quite pleased with my physique. He walked well, was as fit as a fiddle, with a back as straight as a pencil. But the only thing that revealed his age was his weathered skin, his full white beard, and his full head of white hair, which was often covered with a red bandana. I used to love how his blue eyes would stare at me through those wrinkles that so willfully trespassed across his face, giving him that wizened appearance. "Is something wrong, Otis?" asked my mother, who was attacking a big ball of dough and lining it into a pan in order to make the daily bread. "It's this," said my grandfather, rolling up his sleeve reluctantly. We gathered around him nonplussed. My mother let out an audible gasp. "Goodness, that looks like a malignant melanoma. How long have you had that for?" "That's the thing," said my Grandpa Otis. "I have no recollection of having seen this before. I'm sure I should have noticed it." "Well, it's been winter, hasn't it?" said my mother. "We've all been wearing long sleeves. Maybe you didn't notice it." "What's a malignant melanoma?" I asked my mother. My mother sounded guarded. "I'm not saying Grandpa Otis has got a malignant melanoma, because I can't be sure. But I was a nurse once, and I know about these things. This mole looks awfully suspicious. It's uneven in size. It's got strange colours." "What is a malignant melanoma?" I asked again. "It's a mole that might be cancerous," she told me. "But it's nothing to worry about. It needs to be looked at right now, because it might need to be cut out at once, and then they'll send the mole off for a biopsy to check that it isn't cancerous. That's a normal protocol. I'm quite sure everything's going to be just fine. It's in a conspicuous place, and for your Gramps not to have noticed it until now suggests to me that it hasn't been around for very long, and that in itself is very good news." "By Jove," said my grandfather, "isn't life strange? I can't understand why I never saw this before. This thing is a hell of an ugly. Good job they'll be cutting it out." "Is Grandpa going to be all right?" I asked. "Of course, sweetheart," said my mother, wrapping me in her arms reassuringly. "What about our fishing trip?" I asked, realizing that my plans for the day had gone up in smoke and were heading south. I could feel my small little heart sinking like a stone, being plunged into a large body of water and nose-diving to the very bottom. I'd been so looking forward to this, me and my dad and my Grandpa Otis gathered together around the lake, soaking up the sun, pulling in some fine catches of the day. We would then gut them with our sharp knives, and my mother would cook them for lunch when we got back to the cabin. I had been aching for our adventure. It was suddenly like the sky of my day had clouded over in a plethora of pewter clouds and become very grim, very disappointing. "We'll have to take a rain check, son," said my father. "I need to take your grandfather into town to get his mole checked out. I'm very sorry," he said, rubbing an affectionate hand through my white curls. "Still, it can't be helped. These things happen." My grandfather was muttering to himself, "By Jove, I didn't notice it until now. How could I have missed it?" He sounded a little irked with himself, but he was sympathetic towards my plight. "I didn't want to say anything, George. I know you were looking forward to our fishing adventure, but I can't ignore a mole like this. I'm sure you appreciate that." "It doesn't matter, Gramps. You need to check out your mole to make sure you're all right." I sorrowfully watched my father and Grandfather Otis climb into my father's Land Rover, with Sophie jumping enthusiastically onto the back seat, looking decidedly content. Her grey tail was wagging profusely, and she let out a few little woofs as if to say to my dad, "Go on, what are you waiting for?" My father started up the engine, and his Land Rover happily purred down our driveway, and was gone from my sight. And as his truck disappeared, I suddenly felt very sorry for myself. It wasn't fair. I'd so wanted to go fishing, and now this had to happen to throw a spanner in the works. It was soul-destroying. "So what are you going to do this morning?" my mother asked me. "I've some things to do in the kitchen. Would you like to lend a hand, George?" "I'm going to make some apple pie and some stew and dumplings. Would you like to help me? You could perhaps start by peeling the apples for me." I couldn't think of anything worse than lending a hand in the kitchen. That was boring. The only nice part about cooking was when you got to lick out the remains of the cake mix left in the bowl. But beyond that, it was drudgerously dull. Unless, of course, it came to frying up a freshly caught fish and watching it being thrown into a pan with butter, lemon and garlic. That was different. I always felt accomplished when I caught something and enjoyed eating it afterwards. And believe me, nothing tastes better than freshly caught fish. I'm going to play outdoors. I don't want to peel your apples for you. As long as you don't venture too far from the cabin, my mother had said. It was when I ambled outside our cabin. I found myself gravitating towards our sizable outhouse, where we stored all our sporting accessories, our snowmobiles, our kayaks, hiking equipment, and stuff like that. I saw my fishing gear that my father had prepared for me the previous night, ready to go for our morning excursion. I suddenly had a great epiphany. Yes, it was disappointing that my grandfather and my dad had gone to Fairbanks and could not come fishing with me. That was a bummer, but there was no reason I couldn't go alone. Goodness gracious, I was a big boy now. I didn't need to be supervised all the time. I was 10 years old already, and quite a proficient fisherman at that. Grandpa Otis said I was better than he was at fishing when he was my age. And if that was indeed true, I was going to be better than both my father and my grandfather. The lake was a brief walk through the woods, not too far from our cabin. And imagine what Father and Grandpa Otis would say when they came back from Fairbanks to discover my mother cooking up the fish I'd caught for lunch. I visualized my fish lining the pan, swathed in butter and a delicious garlicky smell that lingered audaciously through the kitchen, inviting taste buds to tingle with delight and stomach muscles to twitch and rumble in eager anticipation. I could see my mother beaming from ear to ear with a smile on her face that was so big it could barely fit. "Look what George caught while you were in Fairbanks. He went fishing all on his own. Isn't he an industrious young man?" I could see my grandfather smiling through his sparkling blue eyes at me. "You're not wrong there. George is quite the fisherman." My father would look as pleased as Punch. "My son is a very adept young man. This is an impressive catch indeed. I could never have done that at his age, and to think he did this without our supervision. The mind boggles." As I stood there imagining my father and my grandfather Otis, their celebratory reactions to my fishing accomplishments, I could feel my chest pump up, like a flat tire that had suddenly been filled with air. I felt puffed up and proud. Yes, I would show my family what a remarkable, proficient fisher boy I was. I knew my mother was busying herself in the kitchen, wearing a housecoat with her hands probably caked in flour by now, as she began to knead her dough, while the cats were still lying curled up on my unmade bed, locked up in the blissful, contented world of their dreams, where no doubt they were off catching mice, climbing trees, or stalking unsuspecting birds. I took a camping chair, my fishing rod, and my little wicker basket with me into the woods, and off I went on my merry way. I felt blissfully happy and very contented. The former disappointment I had first felt when my father had put an end to my plans was now overtaken by the thrill of a riveting expedition that I would undertake all on my own. There was something rather fragrant, very appealing, about embarking on your own little daredevil excursion. I was small, so carrying a fishing rod and my supplies was a daunting task, but not for a young boy that was wearing a fat ego, heavier than the stuff I was carrying. My fishing rod was made of fiberglass. It was 3 to 4 foot long, a medium-power rod, I believe it was. The day was extraordinarily beautiful. I mean beautiful. Bird song filtered through the valley. A collection of tweets, warbles and whistles serenaded my approach. Then there were the buzzing sounds of insects, especially bees and pretty butterflies, that bobbed from one flower to another. The woodgrove was so welcoming, as the sun's soft, effusive shadows of light cast their pretty prisms through the tall, towering trees, that were predominantly spruces, hemlocks, cedars, cottonwoods, and paper birches. The ground was carpeted in purple trilliums, along with splatterings of dog-tooth violets and the occasional yellow lily. I ambled happily through the woodgrove, and the woody scent of the terpenes from the pine needles was very refreshing and uplifting, along with the fragrant smell of wild flowers. My sneakers crushed the forest debris under my feet as I walked, so I could hear twigs cracking, snapping and popping. I ambled towards the lake. I stood still for a moment, to stare in awe at the exquisite scenery that met my eyes. The prepossessing turquoise-blue lake twinkled in the morning light, with the silhouettes of the spruce trees clustered together, mirrored on its reflectant surface. In the background was the undulating sweep of the mountains, The lower part of the mountains were carpeted in a viridescent green, but as they ascended into the sky, with their sculptural majesty, in sweeping curls and folds, they became greyer and more subdued, while the deep ridges and crevices at the very top were sprinkled liberally with snow. I stared up at the sky. I swear it was so blue. There wasn't a single cloud in sight. I charged over to the wooden fishing pier, with an eager skip to my step. It had been there long before my father had built the cabin. It was old, and had been exceedingly well built, by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. It was solid and robust, as it had been the day it had first been built. But then again my father had ensured he treated the wood every year, and I guessed that helped to keep it in peak condition. I pulled out my camping chair and cast out my rod, as I sat down to enjoy the feel of the sun washing over my face. I don't know why it is, but after the brutal cruelty of a long drawn-out insufferable winter, where the objectionable temperatures had been as cold as -13 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving Grandpa Otis exceedingly disenchanted, the satisfying feel of that bright, radiant, audacious sunshine brushing against my skin was like a warm, very welcome, pleasant nudge. Let's just say there was nothing quite like it. No sooner than when I'd thrown out my line, where I'd attached one of my father's juicy worms to the end, I could feel an immediate tug, as something had been zealously seduced by my worm. I gallantly wrestled with something that wiggled and oscillated frenziedly at the end of my line. I wound it in slowly, to discover I'd caught a sizable, shiny grey-pink salmon. This thing was huge. After I pulled it out of the lake, it flapped frantically, until I skillfully put it out of its misery with a stone. I then set to work, gutting and filleting it on my portable plastic board, as fastidiously and meticulously as my prudent father had taught me. Then I placed it carefully in the top lining of my wicker basket, with an eager anticipation that more would soon follow. The day seemed to hold within its voluptuous grasp the unspoken promise of an auspicious outcome. I was very impressed with myself, giving myself a self-congratulatory high five. I continued to fish, pulling in a couple more salmon, one after the other. It was looking like an excellent start. I chuckled with glee at my dazzling performance, sitting back confidently on my chair, with a little bit of a haughty swagger, I'm not ashamed to admit. The sunshine that filtered across my face made me sleepy, and a nasty fly began to buzz over my eyes. I slapped it, killing the thing instantly. It rolled off my skin and dropped down on the wooden decking of the pier. I suddenly sat up with a start, looking over my shoulders apprehensively, as I was gripped with a bodeful feeling that clawed at my insides like a crab's pincers, and left my hair on the back of my neck standing up on edge. I got the foreboding sense that I was not alone, and that I was being watched by a pair of menacious eyes that drilled into me like a jackhammer. Then I saw him. He was standing upright against a tall sculptural tree that seemed to have distorted, twisted, crooked claws for boughs, and rude arthritic roots that scandalized the forest floor with their gnarled, nodulous, contorted appendages that were almost as unsightly as the hideously heinous, evil-looking eyes of the man that impertinently intruded on my field of vision, like a nasty splodge of red paint on a pristine canvas. I swear to you, this man's menacing, deep-set eyes were blood red, and when he smiled at me briefly, it looked like his mouth was filled with razor-sharp, jagged fangs. But as he got closer towards me, his teeth looked normal. Had I imagined those fangs, I wondered? Was my mind playing strange tricks on me? As he moved towards me, the bright smile in his face got wider, but there was something about him that sent chills and shivers running down my spine. Who was he, I wondered? What was he doing on my father's land? There was something about this man that made me want to run away as fast as I could. But for some inexplicable, unfathomable reason, I held my ground as he made his approach. I will admit that every part of me was wobbling like a jelly.
"Hello, fisher boy,"
he said to me. "I see you are out here fishing alone. Where are your father and grandfather today? Were they not supposed to accompany you this morning for your fishing expedition? It seems like such a dreadful shame that you're out here all on your lonesome." His voice was raspy, like the hideous, unwelcome voice you might receive from an unknown caller when you're in your house alone, that sends the fear of God coursing through your veins. He had that kind of unsettling, outer-worldly voice. I was stunned. How did this man know about my father and my grandfather? How could he know so much about me and about our fishing expedition when I knew nothing about him at all? I'd never seen him a day in my life. My parents had about as many friends as you could count on one hand. But no, this incongruous stranger, I'd never seen him before a day in my life. And there was something oddly disquieting and rather airy about him that I didn't like. It was like an instinctive sixth sense bubbled up to the surface, like the sparkling bubbles in an effervescent bottle of champagne, warning me that something was seriously off here, and that this idiosyncratic stranger was not whom he appeared to be, but something infinitely more sinister. "They've gone to town," I explained. "My grandfather's got a mole on his arm that needs checking out. But they'll be back any minute now," I said hurriedly. "They'll be joining me very soon." "Why do you lie, little fisher boy?" said the man, rolling his words like butter in his mouth. "Why do you lie so easily on that little tongue of yours? Did your parents not teach you better than that?" His words were gravelly, his tone coarse and croaky. "I'm not lying," I said gingerly. "Oh, but you are, young man. Your grandfather and father have gone to town. They'll be gone for a long time, will they not? But you decided to come fishing on your own accord. You're a naughty little fisher boy, are you not? Your parents will not be pleased with you. You're out here on your own. I mean, anything could happen to you." The emphasis on the last words, "anything could happen to you," were almost unnerving. It was almost like he purred with a smug satisfaction when he said them. "Who are you?" I asked nonplussed. "I don't know you. I've never seen you before a day in my life." "But that does not matter, does it, fisher boy? I know all about you. And I know that your grandfather Otis has just died from a dreadful mole that he's had on his arm. More's the pity." I could see the red, greedy glint in his beady brown eyes as he tormented me, and for a second I got a glimpse of the fangs that suddenly became normal teeth again in the twinkling of an eye, almost as if this strange man was giving off some kind of holographic projection, when very suddenly the hologram would become distorted and I'd get a glimpse of something else hiding behind the masked facade, something clearly not human. "You lie! My grandfather had a mole. He wouldn't die from it, not straight away. And anyway, it may not even be cancer." "Oh, but he did die, young man. Only a few minutes ago." I can feel indignant tears welling up in the corner of my eyes. It couldn't be true, could it? My Gramps had discovered a nasty mole on his arm this morning. Surely it wouldn't kill him outright. But this strange man seemed to know so much. Supposing it was true. Supposing after the doctor cut the mole out of my grandfather's arm, he dropped down dead. My grandfather didn't like the sight of blood. Maybe it wasn't the mole that killed him, but the shock of seeing all the blood during his local anaesthetic. My father used to say that shock could easily kill. I'd seen it with little indigenous wild animals myself, often enough out here in Alaska, and even a little bird that Spotted Dick caught once. I rescued it, but despite my very best efforts to save it, The shock of its grueling encounter with our cat had almost certainly killed it. I watched the man walking over to my wicker basket. "I'm very, very hungry," he said, rubbing his stomach. "Very hungry. What have we got here?" he said, opening the lid of my wicker basket to inspect the contents. To my horror, he pulled out my filleted fish and swallowed the pieces of fish whole, one by one. "Pity there weren't any bones in here. I rather enjoy bones." I stared at him, thinking that I'd never seen a human eat like that before, nor had any human behaved in this outlandish, presumptuous way over raw fish, or just helped themselves to somebody else's catch. It was so rude, I thought. "Trouble is, young man." "Well, fisher boy," he said to me, "that was only hors d'oeuvres for me. I have in mind for myself a far more satisfactory, substantial meal." For a moment his eyes grow red as they land on me, and I can see drool spilling down the corners of his mouth, and that drool is hungry. It's in that moment I realise what this man's intentions are. He wants to eat me. Are you kidding me? I don't know how I knew this. It sounds insanely bizarre, but there was this sense of knowing that washed over every single cell of my body, like a smoke detector going off, sending alarm bells ringing loudly in my gut. I could feel panic seizing up in my veins. Oh, just shooting up, with no restraint. And then I knew exactly what I needed to do. I knew this like I know the grass is green and the sky is blue. I needed to get the hell out of here, the hell away from this man. He's wearing blue jeans and a blue plaid shirt, but lunges towards me, but I dive into the lake without any delay. One thing I do know is how to swim, and how to swim very well. But the man has plunged into the water after me. I found myself panic swimming to the edge of the lake. The powerful adrenaline rush gave me that vital life-saving edge over my nimble pursuer. I stumble awkwardly out of the water as fast as I can, trying to shake as much water as I can off my body. My body is soaked to the skin, my drenched clothes clutching to my skin tightly, my hair sticking to my face. My heart thunders violently in my chest, like shooting stars taking off. The water is freezing, and I am shivering. I crawl over the mud on my hands and knees, panting desperately like a dog. I keep my body close to the ground, terrified of being seen. Never was I more grateful that my clothes were tanned this morning. As my father always believed, even when you were fishing you should be camouflaged to blend in with the environment. He had a sense that maybe the fish could pick up colour. I scramble on my fours over the mud, staggering awkwardly like an intoxicated drunken sailor, lifting myself up behind a spruce tree, where I take cover. Water is dribbling off me like a garment on the washing line that hasn't been wrung out sufficiently well. I'm freezing cold, terribly afraid. I clandestinely peer through the branches stealthily, holding my breath in case that can be heard. I see the horrible man that had chased me swimming to the edge of the lake. I can see the moving water rippling as this long vertical form charges through the water with the grace of an otter. It's not the man that I see rising from the water, but a monstrous creature of over 8 foot tall and 700 pounds, with a Bigfoot-like body, but with brown hair like an otter's, smooth and sleek, clinging to his body tightly, with a waterproof oily film. When it opens its mouth, I can see these horrifying jagged teeth that I'd witnessed before, and I would recognise those red eyes anywhere. The man that I'd seen moments before was really a monster in disguise, hiding behind a 3-dimensional hologram with the head of an otter. Was this really happening? Somehow he'd managed to hide his true appearance behind me, with some kind of cloaking, repatterning system that had changed his appearance altogether. This huge, very brawny creature stands up straight and erect like a ruler. He scans the water with his beady eyes for any sign of movement, any ripples, but he sees nothing. The water remains still. He appears befuddled and bewildered that I could have been such an efficient swimmer, that had escaped his grasp. But had I really? All you can hear is the sounds of the bird song tweeting through the valley. I am so terrified that I continue to hold my breath. The creature begins to search for me frantically. I can tell he's furious to have been outsmarted by me. I'm pretty sure he will find me very soon. How am I going to get away from here? My heart is pounding violently in my chest with heavy drum beats. I'm so affrighted that I don't even feel the coldness that has seeped through my skin from the icy water and my soggy feet that are squishing around in my shoes. Then I hear voices, familiar voices that are sweet-sounding. It's my grandfather and my father's voice.
Why the hell would he go fishing on his own like this? What a naughty boy! Well, you know, George, he can be quite industrious at times, came my grandfather's voice. We should commend him for that.
Oh, goodness, my grandfather was alive. My heart jumped for joy, and then I audaciously ran towards the two men as quickly as I could. But they weren't there. I realized I'd walked into a cunning trap. For some reason, the clever creature, hiding behind a human mask, had successfully managed to mimic my grandfather and father's voices, to lure me out of my hiding place. How could he do that? How could he be this clever? This is masterful trickery that would deceive most, and certainly had fooled me. That is when the creature mocks me.
You think you could hide from me, little fisher boy? You really did. Nobody gets to hide from me.
He lunges towards me. I'm freaking out. My heart shrieks in my chest. My feet turn into concrete blocks. I run with squishing water in my boots from the swimming adventure that makes my run precariously cumbersome and very unproductive. I can't run like this. Oh my God, I'm going to die. I just know it. I'm going to die. I'm really freaking out, screaming at the top of my lungs, really screaming. I don't think I've ever screamed like that before, and believe me, the sound that emanated from the back of my throat could have woken the living dead. Then my biggest fear is realized. The impending dread that I so desperately tried to avoid had abruptly hemorrhaged itself into my life. In a trice, this vile, repugnant creature grabs me, throws me on his back. I try to fight back, but everything happens so fast, like an accident that is beyond your control or ability to stop. I'm certain I'm already dead, although I don't see my life flashing before me, as you might expect. But I do find myself regretting that I'd gone fishing on my own like this. I knew unequivocally that none of this would ever have happened if my two dads had been around. Then I hear something roaring behind me. To my amazement, the creature posing as a man was giving us chase. Something else was carrying me on their shoulders. But who? Someone else had picked me up. But was this big thing that was carrying me friend or foe? I couldn't be sure. Whatever was carrying me on its shoulders was holding me down with one arm. It is huge, big, hairy, lofty, powerfully strong. Its hair is long and dark, not tight and sleek like the creature I'd encountered by the lake. Soon there is no sign of my opponent, that masked man in disguise following us, as we had left him long behind us. I found myself being lowered to the ground very gently, as if I was a fine, fragile ornament that might easily break with heavy handling. I glance through the spaces between the spruce trees. I see the comforting sight of my cabin. I've never seen a more beautiful sight in my life. It was as if for a brief moment my heart skipped with a joyful glee, like a newborn lamb. I am now a hair's breadth away from my cabin, a hair's breadth away from safety. I turn around to look at the creature that rescued me, and for a moment my mouth drops open. My eyes grow wide. This day had grown more and more bizarre with every passing second, and had more in common with a fictional novel than reality. I knew at once it was a Bigfoot. My father told me they were real. He had encountered one once, but I wasn't familiar with his story. The Bigfoot was easily 9 foot tall and 800 pounds, with shoulders on her so powerful I reckon she could easily lift up a car without even breaking a sweat. She's looking at me with deep-set dark eyes that twinkle with humour. I think she's laughing at my bedevilled surprise, at my incredulous disbelief. Hupotasi folakoshasana. You got yourself into quite a scrape, young man, back there. Huponi bilanina. You do realise he wanted to eat you. He kosa fopo. He kana kopa. He's a big trickster. You know, he can change into anything he wants. Akisa hoponi. Nasty piece of work he is. Harshana Sila. He hasn't got a soul, that's for sure. How did you know I needed your help? Harpuni! I didn't, she told me. Harkina Sav! I heard your screams. Huputa Saka! You've got quite the pair of lungs on you. The creature spoke to me in an ancient language that I'm not acquainted with, but it was naturally translated into my head so fluidly. And as I'm well acquainted with the kids in the storybook of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, it didn't strike me at all as strange to speak to a creature in this way, as the children had spoken to the beavers and to Aslam the lion. I looked at the creature who was like Aslam, that life-saving lion in the book of The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe. I was so bemused. Thank you for helping me. Hitasakona. It's a pleasure, young man. Now puta sikita. Now get back home to safety. She stood there in the trees watching me return back to the cabin. I forgot all about my fishing rod and the wicker basket that I had abandoned at the fishing pier. I had forgotten it all, and I was still covered in mud and wet clothes. When I entered the house, I was thrilled to see my mother. I gave her the biggest, barest hug. I missed you, I cried as I ran to her. She was wearing her housecoat. The tears were spilling down my face without restraint. Whatever is the matter, sweetheart, said my mother, clutching me closely to her. She then notices that I'm covered with mud. She pulls away, staring at the muddy footprints on the floor in horror. Goodness gracious, where on earth have you been, George? She said, staring at me in astonishment. You're soaked to the skin. You're covered in mud. It's all over your clothes and your face. Look at you. You look as if you've been rolling in the mud. And look at me as well, she says, pulling off her housecoat that covered her sweatshirt and jeans. You've covered me with mud too. I swam in the lake, I said, deciding not to tell her the full story, as I was still struggling to get my head around it. You swam in the lake? What on earth were you doing there, George? Said my mother, growing even more bewildered. Why on earth would you go swimming in the lake? And why would you be covered in mud? It's a long story. You go and get cleaned up, sweetheart, right now. Put on some decent clothes, and then we'll have some lunch, and then you can tell me exactly what happened afterwards. Before long, my grandfather and Dad returned from town. My grandfather had not dropped down dead, nor did he have the mole removed. It's not a mole. Would you believe it after all that? Apparently it's going to go away on its own accord. There's a scientific name for this kind of a mole that looks like a mole and isn't one. The dermatologist said I got it from knocking against something really hard. It does tend to look like a malignant melanoma straight away, but it's always a false flag. Nothing to worry about. Well, that's a relief, said my mother. We all ate our meal happily together, and my mother failed to ask me about my lake adventure, so I kept my mouth tightly shut. Everything that happened during the day was so crazy, I thought that I must have imagined it all, but I know that I didn't. Grandfa Otis's curious account. I was heartily relieved not to have the dreaded malignant melanoma. I'm an old man now, rather set in my ways, and very resigned to the fact that something will one day take me. In the end, something gets us all. But I wasn't ready to go yet. I figured there were still some years left in the old dog. I hasten to say I was as fit as a fiddle. Maybe not as robust as I used to be. My eyesight was dimming a little, but my hearing was as sharp as ever. Let's just say my muscular physique of my youth was now but a fragrant memory of the past. But that's all part of getting older. It goes with the territory. I had noticed when I returned home from Fairbanks, my grandson George seemed to be otherwise preoccupied, as if he was miles away from our table. It was bizarre behaviour for George. He was not given to daydreaming, and he never ate much over dinner or lunch. He didn't seem down in the dumps or subdued. He seemed almost lost in his thoughts. I did feel rather bad that I had not taken him fishing, and the guilt I felt worsened when I realised that my malignant melanoma was all but a false alarm. We could have gone fishing after all. That unprofitable trip to Fairbanks, waiting around a dermatologist's office, had been a complete waste of time squandered. When you get to my age, time is precious. You don't know how much time you have left. So wasted trips are like an unnecessary expenditure that you can ill afford to splash out on, like buying a sports car on impulse when you know it way exceeds your budget and you can't afford it.
Not to worry, George, I had said to him. We could go fishing tomorrow if you like, if the weather is fine.
I was expecting George to run over to me enthusiastically, giving me a big impulsive hug, and say, "Really, Gramps, that will be brilliant!" But he didn't react like that. Instead, he said gingerly, "I think I'll give fishing a break for a while." I was about to cross-examine him further when Martha returned to the table with heaped plates of apple pie and cream. Let's just say that magnanimous distraction took my attention right away from my grandson, as my nose was filled with the scent of apple and cinnamon, and I got wrapped up in that sensory experience, clean forgetting about my grandson's strange words. I am a light sleeper, always have been, and for some curious reason I woke up with a start, my mind sharply remembering my grandson's perplexing comments. "I'll give fishing a break for a while, Gramps." Strange boy, I thought to myself, sitting up, scratching my head. Strange boy.
Why would George say that to me? Normally he was so excited about the prospect of going fishing. He was always telling me that he was going to catch a much bigger fish than me and his father one day. And I believed him. He was certainly better at fishing than I was at his age. I decided to get out of bed, but when I did so, every part of my body creaked, like an old chair that has got slightly unsteady legs. I slipped my long, thin, rather gnarled-looking feet into my fleece-lined slippers and slipped my arms into my velvety dressing gown. It might be spring, but it was still quite fresh at night. I was going to make myself a hot toddy. This was a great trick of mine that worked like a charm every time I had a restless night or I suffered from flu. I ambled to the kitchen, mixing 2 fingers of whiskey with 2 teaspoons of honey and 2 teaspoons of lemon juice, which I placed in a pot on the hob. It is at that precise moment I heard a peculiar shuffling sound on the front porch, as if something was moving around there. I hastily grabbed my torch and my rifle and threw open the well-oiled door, and that was when I saw her. Nothing was to prepare me for what my eyes would see. The moon was clear that night, sitting on the roof of the sky with a congenial smile, while her bright light effusively lit up the area around the cabin, so I could see the idiosyncratic creature quite clearly in the moonlight. Of course I knew what she was at once. There could be no mistake about it in my mind. It was a Bigfoot. I stood there gawking, my mouth hanging open like a flycatcher. I even rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't dreaming. I think the thing that astounded me the most was how remarkably human she was. Yes, she was covered in long flowing hair. Yes, she was gargantuan in size and girth, easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds by my reckoning. But what I found more extraordinary than anything else was the intelligence in her deep-set dark eyes and the benevolence that accompanied her. I don't know who was more surprised, me to see her or her to see me. But she did not run away. Instead, she pointed to the fishing basket and the rod, which I recognized at once as belonging to my grandson. Then the strangest, most curious thing happened. She spoke to me in a strange language that telepathically was translated into my head. "Ipasa kasana po, hasila." I brought him his rod back, and his basket, she said. "He tasana fo." He left it by the lake. "Don't let him go fishing again on his own. Not without you with him." I nodded, as if what she was telling me was the most normal thing in the world. But then she was gone. I watched her shadowy, lofty form
disappearing into the woodgrove, and I just stood there, just staring in abject awe. I returned to the kitchen. My hot toddy was boiling over on the hob. I'd need to make it a double hot toddy tonight, with even more alcohol, after my outlandish encounter with such an extraordinary, majestic creature. What did she mean I shouldn't let George go fishing unaccompanied on his own? It would seem George had a lot of explaining to do the following morning. At breakfast I asked George if he'd gone fishing without us the previous day at the lake. His face flushed bright red. He hung his head bashfully, while tears spilled down his cheeks. "I did, Gramps. I'm really sorry. I left my fishing rod and my basket by the lake, but I had to run away, you see. This monstrous thing was after me. I know he wanted to eat me. He looked like a human, but that was a mask. I know it was. He was really a giant otter. I know it's hard to believe, but I promise you it's true." George began to recount his story from the previous day. I listened to him incredulously, but I knew no matter how fictitious and far-fetched his story might sound, it was the truth. You see, I had heard of strange encounters with a trickster like this before. "You know what you saw, son," I told him. "You saw the Kushtaka. He's known as the Otter Man. He can shapeshift, take on human appearances, mimic people's voices, and he has telepathic and mind-reading abilities, which means he knows things about you. As you well know, young man, many people go missing in Alaska every year, around the Alaskan Triangle most especially, and there are many wise and astute among us that instinctively believe that the Kushtaka is behind these mystifying disappearances. He is cunning, very manipulative, a great trickster. I'm sure that is what you encountered. It seems the Bigfoot saved you from him. I hope you will have in mind not to go fishing on your own again." "Yes, Gramps, I won't, I promise." "Just so you know, your Bigfoot friend popped around last night, dropped off your basket and fishing rod for you." "She did," said George, his eyes lighting up with excitement. My son looked at me as if I was speaking a foreign language. "You saw a Bigfoot here last night. She came to our cabin. Yes, she did. A very intelligent, kind, lofty creature she was. She seemed very concerned about little George here." "Well, I will be damned," said my son, looking at me with surprise. "I'll be damned. You got to speak to a Bigfoot. Why is this not a fair world? You always get the luck, Dad. I get the short straw." My son's wife, Martha, came into the room with a big beam on her face. "I think your Bigfoot failed to mention she left 4 fresh salmon for us in the basket." My grandson ran over to the basket, pulling out the fish excitedly. "I told you she was nice. Can we have fish for breakfast?" Before long we were gathered together around the kitchen table, tucking into the most delectable, melt-in-the-mouth salmon that was swaddled in butter and garlic, brought to us courtesy of a Bigfoot. Did life get better than this? I think not. "As you know, I've also seen a Bigfoot, but not up close and personal like the two of you," said my son. "When was this, son?" I asked curiously. "I seem to remember you mentioned encountering one once." "It happened when I was building this cabin from scratch. For days on end I got the strange sense that someone was watching me from the trees. I would look behind me and stare at the trees, shake my head, tell myself my imagination was clearly playing tricks on me. And that was when I caught sight of this face peering at me from behind a tree. And I suddenly gave this thing chase. I saw it was a Bigfoot, but so fleetingly. But I remember the human face and the very long, flowing dark hair. When I continued to build our cabin, I always got the sense I was being watched. I knew it was a Bigfoot." "How extraordinary," said Martha, wiping away the garlic butter from around her mouth. "It's like that Bigfoot knew everything about us, and yet we knew nothing about her. I'm assuming it's the same Bigfoot that rescued our George." The Bigfoot told me she rescued me because she heard me scream so loudly. Even I was surprised, Gramps, that I could scream that loud. Martha chuckled. She glanced at my son very briefly. Remember what the nurse said at the hospital after George was born? My son grinned. That boy's got a fine pair of lungs on him, he has. Some things never change. Suffice to say, my grandson George never did go fishing again on his own. But neither of us have ever forgotten our outlandish encounters with that female Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Julia Henderson was bleary-eyed when she stumbled out of the restaurant, like an intoxicated drunk, her face red, the tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She staggered awkwardly on her high-heeled shoes towards her truck, nearly tripping over the asphalt pavement in her speedy haste to get away. The lights of the twinkling town of Beaufort, South Carolina, were bright and welcoming. The soft puddles of moonlight congenially lit up the sky with a generous warmth, while the twinkling stars shone like polished diamonds set against a luxurious black velvety ether. Julia barely noticed the clusters of people gathered outside a nearby bar that looked like it was tightly packed like a tin of sardines. There were people standing outside the bar with fluted wine glasses and exotic colourful cocktails in their hands, chirruping garrulously among themselves. There was musical laughter, giggles, raised voices that filtered into the air, echoing against the soft breeze. The statuesque towering oak trees that fringed either side of the pavement, with their long sculptural limbs that stretched upwards and outwards, rustled their branches in the breeze, as if they were dancing happily under the pleasing impressions of this uplifting, celebratory evening, when not many were sad in heart or spirit, for even the crickets and frogs had picked up the convivial atmospheric resonance. They sang their cheerful choruses accordingly, with enthusiastic trills, like the sounds from hundreds of minuscule electric guitars. The evening held within its harmonious rhythm the happy ambience of a regular Friday night evening, when the townsfolk were looking forward to enjoying the weekend that stretched out before them. Their happy moods might have been infectious if Julia had not felt so desolate, like a lost island in the Pacific, that no one remembered even existed. As she exited the restaurant, the folk standing outside local bars and restaurants alike, on the ribbon of pavement, remained unheedingly oblivious and blindly ignorant that in their midst was a woman with a heart so broken up, so fragmented, she may as well have been shot in the chest with a sawn-off shotgun, for that is exactly how the young woman felt, broken, grief-stricken, doleful, very aggrieved. Not one of these people noticed Julia's shadowy figure, slipping through the bright lights, like a ghost moving from the pavement towards the parking bay, with the clumsiness of a drunken sailor. Let's just say her stability on her high heels left much to be desired, along with the misty fog of her own tears, that meant her vision had been robbed of its clear focus. There was one couple that did notice Julia. They had left the asphalt parking bay, locking their truck behind them, as they marched towards the bright lights of the Italian restaurant that Julia exited moments before. She nearly collided into the unsuspecting couple. They could see a distraught, elegant young woman, dressed to the nines in a stunning black dress, who looked as white as a ghost, with mascara trails running down her skin like skid marks, and the rain of her tears streaming down her face. "Oh, sorry," said Julia, as she almost knocked into the man. I wasn't looking where I was going. I'm terribly sorry." "Are you all right, love?" asked the kindly man, who was walking arm in arm with his wife, looking at Julia with a genuine warmth in his steely grey eyes. Even a perfect stranger had shown more compassion towards her than that jerk, Jack Sullivan. "I'm fine," she whispered, almost choking on her words, managing to give the couple a watery smile. "You don't look fine," said the woman who was standing next to her husband. "Would you like to talk about it? I'm sure my husband wouldn't mind if you and I had a drink together. I'm a good listener, you know. Whatever has upset you, I'm sure it's not that bad." "I'm fine," said Julia defensively again, her lips quivering awkwardly. "But I don't think you look fine," says the woman. "You sure you don't want to talk to me?" "I'm sure," said Julia, "but thanks all the same." The couple nodded at her, giving her another concerned look, but they ambled towards the restaurant, talking together in low voices. Julia knew she wasn't fine. That was a joke. She'd never be fine ever again. She opened her purse, and in the hazy blur of her tears, she struggled aimlessly to find the keys of her white Nissan Rogue that didn't want to be found. A silver lipstick rolls down the asphalt paving. A powder compact smashes. The mirror shatters. A lonely notebook and a cell phone thump onto the ground. Coins roll out of a weathered-looking wallet that pops open like a bust zipper. Then there are the wispy paper checkout slips that blow up in the soft gusts of wind, getting ensnared in its tricky grasps. They mischievously float down the parking bay, like misbehaving autumn leaves that just can't be caught. She grabs her things, dropping down onto her hands and knees to retrieve everything in haste, stuffing everything cack-handedly into her now bloated purse that is struggling to shut. She climbs hurriedly into her truck, glancing briefly over her shoulders towards the bright lights of the restaurant, praying that Jack Sullivan won't come bolting out, as she senses he will in any moment. She flops onto her seat, like a sagging bag of potatoes, and slams the door behind her, pulling the safety belt reluctantly across her chest. Then she sees Jack, dashing out of the restaurant, as she suspected. His handsome, symmetrical face looks pinched, his lips white. His brown, anguished eyes sweep across the parking bay, and he runs towards her in his smart Levi jeans and the white flannel shirt, now covered with bright red stains. He is frenziedly trying to wave her down. He's acting like he really cares. What a joke! Right now she hated Jack Sullivan more than any other man that dared to draw breath on the face of this planet. And right now she'd gladly mow him down with her rubber tires if given half the chance. At this moment her heart is wretchedly broken, but she's also angry, furious. She can feel an indignation bubbling up inside her, like the steam from a kettle, or the effervescent bubbles in a bottle of champagne. Jack continues to wave at her madly, screaming for her to stop, his earnest eyes pleading with her. His mouth is opening and closing like a gog-eyed goldfish. He looks ridiculous, she thinks to herself, with a smug sense of satisfaction. She hopes he was humiliated tonight. She certainly was.
"Julia, stop! Please stop! We need to talk! Come on, be reasonable! We need to talk about this!"
What about, she thinks? Hadn't he said enough already? All he needed to ever say? The car jolted and heaved as she accelerated as fast as she could down the long ribbon of asphalt, past the oak trees, beyond the small bright lights of the twinkling town. She had no idea where she was driving. She could have been driving to the moon for all she cared, as long as she could get as far away from Jack Sullivan as possible. She robotically drove through the lights of the town of Beaufort, the second oldest city in South Carolina. She navigated her way blindly, more from natural instincts than any kind of focus, for her line of vision, due to the mist of her tears, had become ambiguously obscure. As Julia drove, she clutched the steering wheel so tightly that the whites of her knuckles became very conspicuous. She wiped her tears away with the back of her naked arms. Who would have thought the night could go pear-shaped like this, just when things between her and Jack Sullivan had seemed so promising? Seconds later she hears a loud smash. She jumps out of her skin as she slams on her brakes. She's only just gone and rear-ended somebody's truck. She then reluctantly climbs out of her truck, wearing a sheepish expression on her face, for she knows this collision is entirely her fault. That's what you get when you're not looking where you're actually going. An indignant man climbs out of his truck, After slamming on his brakes, he bolts towards Julia, his rounded face wearing a capriciously belligerent expression. He glares at Julia through bull-terrier-like eyes, while his bald head shines under the moon, as if it's been polished to perfection. He swings his arms indignantly, and for a brief moment her tears dry up, as she stares at the stranger apologetically through her red eyes. "I'm really sorry. I didn't see you."
"What do you mean by driving like a complete maniac?" he shouts, slamming into my back like that. "Look what you've done. Are you drunk?" he asks her suddenly, his judicious discerning eyes sweeping over her suspiciously, and he steps closer to see if he can smell any alcohol on her breath. "No, I'm not drunk. I'm sorry. I've just had a bit of a rough night, that's all." The man does not look at all sympathetic. He sighs warily. "That's no excuse. I've had a long, hard day too, you know. This is all I bloody need. They say women are better drivers than men. Ha! Are you kidding me? They've got their stats screwed up. My wife's exactly like you, always annoyingly driving into people's backsides. You know what the problem with women is? They've never got any bloody patience, always in a tearing hurry they are, always in a bloody rush to get from A to B. You women might not be responsible for some of the fatal driving accidents out on our roads, but let me tell you something for a fact. Women cause more scrapes and bumper bangs than any of us men do. Half of you haven't got a bloody clue how to park. Look what you've done to my truck," he says, examining the huge big bang on its rear. "You're going to have to give me your details for my insurance purposes." The cell phone in his pocket starts ringing. He pulls it out, letting out a loud, audible sigh. "What is it now, Rita? I told you I've been to the store already. I've got your bloody orange juice, Rita. And if you want anything else, I'm not bloody going to get it for you. I'm not going back to the store. I've been on the road all day. I'm tired now." "What is that you say? I shouldn't talk to you like this. How do you expect me to talk to you, Rita, when some bloody idiot has only just rammed into my backside? What did you say? You want milk? You've got to be kidding me. You mean I've got to go traipsing all the way back to the store? How much bloody milk do you need, then?" Julia's face brightens as she looks at the man, hurriedly dashing over to her trunk. This is her opportunity to redeem herself. She pulls out one of her grocery bags and hands a bag to the man. "It's long-life milk, but it's good stuff. You can't taste the difference, I promise you. That's why I buy it. It'll save you a trip to the store." "Rita, I've got some long-life milk for you. Will that do?" "It will. Good. Then I'll see you back at home." He switches off his cell phone and accepts the bag gratefully from Julia. His demeanour shifts. "I'm sorry, love. I didn't mean to give you a hard time. I'm very grateful for the long-life milk. That wife of mine, Rita, keeps me busy, you know, like a hamster on a wheel. And the last thing I need after the day I've had is to go back to the store again. I'm usually on the road all day, so I can sometimes be a bit like a bear with a sore head. The day's been insufferable." "I know what you mean. I feel the very same way." They exchange details, and the man drives away, while Julia, in her dreadful state, finds she needs to keep driving. Her thoughts are so jumbled. She can't think straight, but at least her tears have dried up. 12 hours earlier, Julia arrived at the office with a skip to her step and a huge smile on her face. Life didn't get better than this. She had discovered she was 3 months pregnant a couple of days ago. She had agonized about what to do. She so wanted to keep the baby. She'd always wanted a child, and getting rid of the baby in her womb was not even an option for her. She had fallen head over heels in love with Jack Sullivan, so the natural thing to do was to tell him that he was going to be a father. She was not sure how he would take the news. He had talked about how one day he'd like to have children, and it sounded like his idea of one day was away in the future. Even so, life was not like the script of a play.
where things happened according to a tight schedule. Real life was very different. Sometimes there were hiccups along the way, but things usually worked themselves out in the end. It was incredible how she and Jack had met, and the seeds of their relationship had flourished from thenceforth. The serendipitous events of how they had fortuitously met had almost been written by a romantic novelist, and yet it had happened to her, just like in the storybooks. It would be the kind of story she could tell her wide-eyed grandchildren one day. "Yes, that's how me and your Gramps met," she could hear her future granddaughter saying. "By Jove, Granny, that's the most romantic thing I've ever heard." Julia remembers that auspicious day as vividly as if it happened yesterday. She had been taking her white little Shih Tzu, Cookie, for a walk one morning. She'd hurried back to her apartment when she had heard the ominous booms of thunder rolling in the distance. In a moment of abject horror, she had stared up at a gunmetal grey sky that looked like the bloated clouds were about to wreak havoc on the earth. At first, a single raindrop had landed on her, but then the heavens opened and the rain bolted down without restraint, determined to unleash its wrath on any wayward pedestrians. She knew she was in trouble. Julia hated storms with a passion, but she was several blocks away from her apartment. She was getting completely soaked to the skin, and poor little Cookie was whimpering. He didn't like the sounds of the thunder either. Julia stepped up her pace as she hurried down the road, picking Cookie up in her arms. They were being hosed down by the frenzied assault of the rain. Then there on the asphalt grey road, a grey-silver sleek-looking sports car drew up to her and stopped. "Hurry! Quickly get into my truck! Otherwise you're going to drown out there!" came a friendly man's voice. Julia had not even batted an eyelid or considered the ramifications of accepting a lift from a perfect stranger. Now was not the time to be choosy. She gratefully dashed to the young man's truck, apologetic about the water she and Cookie had invited into his car. The dribbling water from her clothes audaciously trespassed over the leather seats, saturating everything, but the young man did not appear to mind or care. "Thank you so much," she said, pulling her soaked hair away from her face. "I'm so incredibly grateful. It's bucketing down there, it really is. I don't understand. It looked like such a fine day in the beginning, but the weather's just suddenly changed so dramatically." "It's a pleasure to be of help," said the man, giving her a warm smile. "I see your dog's grateful to be in my truck. They can be a little intimidated by thunder. My grandfather's dog Jumbo, he's a huge giant, you know, but when there's a thunderstorm, he makes himself as tiny as a ball and hides away from the storm. Dogs have much more sensitive hearing than us, you know, so I guess that a thunderstorm might sound like Armageddon to many of them." "I hadn't thought of it like that," said Julia. "If a thunderstorm sounds like Armageddon, what about the 4th of July, with all those fireworks? That's got to be a hell of a scary thing for a dog." "Tell me about it," said the man, waving his arm in the air. "The 4th of July can be very traumatic for animals. I should know, I'm a vet, you see. On the 4th of July, people are busting down my doors for tranquilizing drugs for their dogs. The shelters report an influx of runaway dogs, and then there's increased fatalities on the road from distraught animals running away from the booming sounds. Oh, by the way, how rude of me. My name is Jack Sullivan, and who might you be?" Julia's face turned bright pink as the stranger studied her curiously through his steely grey eyes. Her heart almost skipped a beat, as in a space of a couple of minutes she felt a strong attraction towards the stranger, who rescued her from the storm, rather like a gallant knight riding a jet-black horse, but in this case the stranger had been riding a silvery sports car. "The name's Julia Henderson," she said. "My dog is Cookie." When Cookie heard his name being mentioned, he poked his head towards the stranger, letting out a happy woof. "I see your dog Cookie knows his name very well," he laughs. "So your name is Julia. I like it. So where to, Julia?" "What do you mean?" "Well, I need to take you home, don't I? You're soaked to the skin. You obviously need a change of clothes and to get back into the warm.
I can see the rain looks like it's coming down in sheets, and it's not about to stop any time soon."
Julia directed the kindly stranger through the rain towards her apartment block, a red-bricked federal-style building, basked under the canopy of some sculptural oak trees and set back on a pristinely manicured lawn, with flower beds bursting with white roses and green foliage. Jack diligently drives through to the parking bay at the back of the building, and being the gallant gentleman he clearly is, escorts her and her dog under the canopy of his large black umbrella, through to the reception area, and then towards the lift, and finally to the 4th floor of the apartment block where Julia lived.
"Right, now that I've seen you to your door, I'll love you and leave you. Very good to meet you, Julia. I'm sure I'll see you around."
"Thanks for the lift, Jack. Would you like to come in for a coffee? It's the least I can do after you rescued me from the rain." Jack had seemed hesitant for a moment. She was to learn later that this was due to the fact that he was in a relationship with a woman called Pearl, whom Jack had been dating for over 8 months. But after meeting Julia, he had felt a spark between them that he couldn't ignore, so he agreed to that cup of coffee, against his better judgment.
"Why not?" he said, giving her a grin. "Coffee would be nice."
She had led Jack into her apartment, blow-dried her dog's hair, and hurriedly put on a fresh pair of jeans and a sweatshirt. And after she'd made Jack coffee, he'd thanked her, taken down her phone number, and she hadn't heard a dicky bird from him for a couple of months. But then one day, out of the blue, her cell phone rang, and a familiar masculine voice at the other end said,
"Could I please speak to the RainGirl?"
"I don't know any RainGirl," she had asked, nonplussed. "This is Julia Henderson speaking. I'm afraid you've got the wrong number."
"You disappoint me, RainGirl. Am I that forgettable? Don't you remember me? I rescued you and your dog Cookie from the pouring rain 2 months back. I've thought about you quite a lot since then, I hasten to say. But it's clear you've forgotten about me."
"Well, it was 2 months ago, I might remind you. No, I haven't forgotten you."
"Good, because I was wondering if you would kindly accompany me to dinner tomorrow night. I would really enjoy your company."
Julia paused for a moment, and there was a long drawn-out silence at the end of the telephone.
"RainGirl, are you still there?"
came the voice, that seemed to have lost its confident edge. "Yes! Oh, I'm so sorry. Dinner would be great," says Julia.
"Good. I'll pick you up at 7. I haven't forgotten your address."
Let's just say after the first dinner date, there were fireworks between the young couple, and they both knew that they had a connection. But in the beginning, Julia had played it cool. She didn't believe in rushing into relationships like a bull in a china shop, and so her friendship with Jack had eventually blossomed into a budding romance. Jack continued to call her his RainGirl, describing her as the most beautiful thing to emerge out of the rain. So as Julia bounced out of her revelry, she places her purse on her desk and beelines towards the office kitchen, where her friend Patricia is already making coffee. Julia and Patricia had become like bosom buddies at the advertising agency where she worked. Right now, Julia was bursting to tell Patricia her great news. It was Patricia whom she had confided in the day prior. "You're pregnant! That's brilliant! That's great news!" "But is it really?" Julia had asked her, with a hangdog expression. "I mean, me and Jack, we've only been together for 8 months, you know. How do you think he's going to take this news?" "I think he'll be delighted," said Patricia enthusiastically. "The two of you are meant to be. Anyone can see that. My God, even the way you met was written in the stars, and I can see the man is besotted by you." Julia had tugged awkwardly at a ringlet of her dark hair, twisting it tightly in her hand, a habit she adopted when she was nervous about something. "I'm not sure how he's going to take it, Patricia. I'm really worried about it. You see, he did tell me once he wanted children in the distant future, but not now. So I'm not sure if he's going to be terribly pleased about my news." "Oh, don't be so ridiculous. I'm quite sure he's going to be over the moon about it. You need to tell him tonight. You said you were going over to his apartment for dinner. Is that right?" "Yes, he's cooking his mother's beef with black bean sauce that he wants me to try." "Well, you tell him then, don't you?" Julia bounds towards the kitchen, where Patricia is preparing herself coffee. Ever since Julia had fallen pregnant, the smell of coffee had become quite repugnant to her, But she is not put off by its smell this morning, because she can't wait to tell Patricia her good news. Patricia does not see Julia, as she's so caught up in preparing her coffee, mixing in the frothing milk. "You scared the hell out of me, Julia. I didn't see you creep up on me like that. How did it go last night? Did you tell Jack that you were pregnant?" Julia smiled broadly. "I did. And what happened? Tell me." "Well, at first it wasn't terribly good. He went strangely quiet. The colour drained from his face. He looked at me with wide eyes." And what?" "Well, he asked how it happened, of course. I explained I'd been a bit lackadaisical with taking my pills. At first he looked dispirited and downcast. In that moment my heart felt as if it had gone tumbling down a rolling hill. He asked me what I was going to do about it." "What did you say?" "I said I wanted to keep the baby, of course." "And?" "Well, he seemed pleased. He smiled. Then he threw me up in the air and said, 'I'm going to be a father,' and we danced around the kitchen. He seemed terribly happy about it." Patricia gives her friend a huge hug. "Oh, I'm so pleased. Didn't I tell you he'd be thrilled?" It was later in the day that Julia's cell phone had pinged with a message. "We need to talk," came the message. "I'll meet you at our favourite restaurant in town at 7 tonight." When Patricia had seen the message, she had hooted like an owl, her eyes shining brightly. She grabbed Julia's arm. "We need to go shopping right now!" "What are you talking about?" asked Julia. "Are you really that dim?" asked Patricia. "Julia, wake up! Jack has asked you to go to your favourite restaurant tonight, so he can pop the question. Wake up! Smell the coffee!" "You think so?" asked Julia, her eyes shining brightly. "You really think so?" She loved Jack Sullivan. If he was going to propose, she'd have said yes 2 months ago. "Think so, Julia? I know so. Oh my God, this is so exciting. Mills and Boons, here we come. Barbara Cartland, eat your heart out." "What on earth is going on in here?" says several people bustling into the tight kitchen at the advertising agency, sensing the ebullient mood and the animated voices that resounded throughout the office with a celebratory chaos that meant people were stirred up in the whirling excitement of the moment. Patricia, who was forever the drama queen, was making effusive gestures with her arms, oscillating them above her head dramatically, as if she was in a football stadium, cheering on her favourite team that was clearly winning, judging by her contagiously jubilant mannerisms. "Let's just say," she said to the audience of curious spectators that had gathered around her in a cosy cluster, "let's just say a little birdie tweeted to my instincts and it promptly informed me. Tonight Jack Sullivan is going to pop the question to Julia here at their favourite Italian restaurant. He's going to ask her to marry him. Isn't that wonderful?" she says, drawing in a deep breath. Julia's work colleague's face burst into gasps of astonishment, followed by thrilled smiles. "That's so wonderful, Julia. Are you sure?" "Absolutely," said Patricia with conviction. "Methinks our Julia here should forget about working today. It's the hairdresser, the nail salon, and a sexy little black number that are in order here. You've got to look $1 million when he pops the question. Julia, you're going shopping with me. There's a fabulous designer boutique down the road. I saw the perfect black dress in the window the other day. I think it'll look sensational on you." "I'm not sure about this," said Julia. I'm not even sure he's going to propose to me. We're just assuming he is." "Oh, go on. Listen to Patricia," everyone had said. "You go on, get shopping, buy that black number. We want to hear all about your fabulous evening." The day had gone like a whirlwind. Julia had felt as if she'd been thrown from one roller coaster to another, as if she was in a child's fairground. Thank God for Patricia guiding the way, like the bright star of David, because Julia had been like one of those awestruck shepherds, staggering around in the animated chaos of her excitable mind. Her thoughts jumbled, her stomach twisted up in knots. It was flapping away, as if hundreds of butterflies had taken her belly over as a colony. What would she be like when Jack proposed, if she was as dithery as this right now? Soon she stood in front of the mirror, that one of her friends had retrieved from a bathroom, barely recognizing herself. She looked like she'd stepped out of a bandbox. Her dark hair was perfectly blow-dried. It shone and gleamed. Her makeup was meticulous, and the little black number clung to her in all the right places, and she had to admit she looked good enough to grace the red carpet in Hollywood. "You look incredible! Doesn't she look incredible?" said Patricia. "Yes, you look incredible," everyone agreed in the office. Julia continued to look at her reflection from every angle, very pleased with what she was seeing. The dress was sensational. It was perfect for a proposal. "Now you need to act shocked when Jack proposes," said Patricia. Julia tries to put on some surprised looks, but Patricia is sighing with frustration. "You're not convincing me, Julia. You need to let your mouth naturally fall open. You need to gasp." But every time Julia tried to act like she was astonished, her reaction looked more and more put on. In truth, she looked like she was sitting in the dental chair, waiting for the dentist to examine her teeth. "With the greatest of respect, Patricia, Julia looks like she's got something stuck at the back of her throat and needs the Heineck maneuver. She doesn't look like she's shocked when she opens her mouth like that. I honestly think that she should just be herself," said Richard, who managed the agency. "Why you women need to turn everything into a soap opera, God only knows. For goodness sake, let the poor girl be herself when the man proposes. He's marrying her after all, not her shocked reaction." "But don't you get it, Richard?" said Patricia in frustration. "It's very significant that Julia doesn't let on that she knows that Jack is about to propose to her. That would be dreadful. She must look as if she's very surprised, shocked, and then very delighted." "By God," said Richard, "I'm damn glad I'm not a woman, let me tell you. You sure know how to complicate things. It's like you're playing producer, Patricia, and Julia here is the actress under your charge. Isn't this getting a wee bit ridiculous? Over the top, perhaps? I think poor Jack Sullivan is going to think Julia here is having a choking fit when he pops the question." He pauses for a moment, shaking his head. "Well, what do I know?" he says, shrugging. "Good luck, Julia. I hope it goes well for you tonight. I'll say this, though, you look $1 million, and if your man doesn't pop the question, then he's a complete idiot." "Thanks, Richard," she says shyly, her face blushing. "That's so kind of you to say." It was 7:10 when Julia made her way tentatively to the restaurant. It was her prerogative to leave a man waiting. Her heart races at 100 miles an hour, as she could feel the nerves rising up in her gut. My God, even her hands were trembling. If she carried on this way, she'd have a panic attack before she even reached the table. "Good evening, madam," says the gentleman in reception. "Have you got a booking for this evening, or would you like a table?" "We've got a booking. Well, I have, with Jack Sullivan. It's that man over there in the white flannel top. I'm having dinner with him tonight." "That's table number 9. Come with me, madam," says the waiter, leading her over to the table and pulling out a chair for her. Jack leans over to give her a kiss, giving her an approving once-over. "My word, RainGirl, you do scrub up well. That black dress is very amazing. Your hair looks stunning." Julia flashes in delight as she sits down at the table, and the waiter hands them their menus. "Thanks," she says demurely. "I thought a little pampering was in order. It's been ages since I've been to the hairdresser's and the nail bar." "Well, you look marvellous," says Jack. "It was money well spent. Besides, you deserve a lot of spoiling." The ambience in the restaurant is electric. It's a Friday night after all, so it's buzzing with activity. The waiters flying past them with silver trays bedecked with colourful-looking cocktails and Hawaiian umbrellas. People's voices are remarkably cheery. The smells of an Italian restaurant with its basil, oregano, tomato sauce and meatballs seem to waft over the restaurant, making stomachs rumble with hunger. She can hear the tinkling of glasses and the clinking of cutlery, and a young man is singing some Frank Sinatra, so the mood is mellow and romantic, just perfect for a proposal to bring a greater swing to the evening. "Would the both of you like anything to drink?" the waiter asked them, with his pen at the ready to scribble down their order.
"I tell you what, why don't you bring us a bottle of French champagne?" said Jack. "I feel like something effervescent and sparkling. It's the weekend, after all. Time to celebrate, especially when you look this good."
Julia's face lifts. Jack was breaking out all the stops tonight, ordering French champagne. Patricia was absolutely right. He was definitely going to propose tonight. Julia found herself barely able to read the menu. She just stared blankly at the writing, not reading a thing. She was twitching with an enervated, nervous anticipation.
"I tell you what, I'll have your meatballs with pasta and tomato sauce," says Jack.
"I think I'll have exactly the same," says Julia.
"I'm starved tonight," Jack told her. "I could eat a horse after everything you told me last night with your being pregnant. Well, I have to tell you, it came as quite a shock to me. I've been doing a lot of thinking."
Julia could see Jack tugging at the pocket of his jeans.
"Damn," he says,
leaning down on the floor as if to grab something. This was it, Julia thought. Oh my goodness, Jack was about to get on his knees in front of the entire restaurant and to propose to her. But instead he reaches for a tissue that had dropped onto the floor and blows his nose.
"Oh dear, I think I'm getting a touch of hay fever here."
Julia feels her face colouring. Maybe he was going to propose at the end of the meal, she thinks.
"Well, put it this way, RainGirl. When you told me you were pregnant, it came as one hell of a shock to me," he says, reaching out to grab her hand to give it a tight squeeze. "I was wondering in the circumstances,
Yes, said Julia.
I was wondering if you would consider a termination of your pregnancy. I know it's a big ask."
This time Julia doesn't have to pretend to be shocked. She genuinely is. Her mouth drops open. "But I don't understand."
"I'm not ready to be a father, RainGirl. I told you I want to enjoy myself a little before I settle down to become a father. I'm not ready to take that step."
At that precise moment, the waiter arrives at their table promptly, with 2 plates brimming over with pasta, tomato sauce and meatballs. He places the pasta in front of them. The delicious aromas permeate the air, and Jack picks up a bowl of parmesan, sprinkling it liberally over his food.
"This looks delicious," he tells the waiter. "I can't wait to get stuck in."
"Enjoy your meals," said the waiter, gliding away smoothly. Julia's heart sinks like a plummeting stone, descending into the murky depths of a sludgy river. He wasn't here to propose to her. What was she thinking? He was here to ask her to get an abortion. He didn't want to commit to her. Not at all. He wanted her to terminate her pregnancy. He probably didn't even love her. If he did, he would never have asked her to do such a nonsensical thing. What Julia does next stuns even her. "How dare you, Jack! I'm not getting rid of this baby! No, I'm not!" She grabs the plate of meatballs and pasta and throws them at Jack's white flannel shirt. The meat and red sauce splatter all over him, and the plate smashes to the ground and breaks with a thunderous crash. Jack looks as if he's been shot in the torso and is bleeding profusely, as meatballs, pasta and globlets of streaming tomato sauce come trickling down his shirt onto the wooden floor below. Every head in the restaurant turns towards their table. A bemused Jack wipes away the pasta and tomato sauce with a napkin.
"Bloody hell, Julia! Why the hell did you do this? Everyone is watching. This hot sauce is piping hot."
"I don't give a damn, Jack. I hate you. I hate you. If you're wondering why I threw pasta at this man," she says, staring wildly at the audience of diners who are watching everything before their eyes with abject astonishment. Julia points accusingly at Jack.
"You see this man over here? This man sitting here, as if butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. He's asked me to murder my own baby."
There are gasps from the diners, as in tears Julia stumbles out of her chair, running past the shocked restaurateur and dashing out towards the carport, tottering on her high heels in an awkward haste, not daring to look back. One man shouts after her,
"Good on you, girl! You stand up for your unborn baby."
It was only after Julia had rear-ended the strange man's truck that she was startled out of her emotional turmoil
for a moment, as the reality of what had happened that evening enabled her to come back down to earth with a rude awakening. Her tears had dried up, but her anger had revved up a notch or two. She kept driving on into the night, finding herself gravitating towards the off-country roads, where the embankments were liberally littered with a plethora of trees. It felt so good to be driving. It seemed to ease her mind, calm down her angst. And something dashed out in front of her truck, and she didn't really see it, even though she wasn't driving fast. But she heard a horrible thump. Oh my God, she'd hit something. This was all she needed. She stopped her truck in the middle of the road, her heart now very heavy. She was certain she'd killed something. Was it a dog, a cat, a deer? She couldn't be sure. It had happened so quickly. It was such a magnificently beautiful night. Too bad it had to be cruelly tainted with Jack Sullivan's unkind words that hung around her like an odious bad smell that she could not abate. A light breeze from the whooshing trees brushed against her face. She could smell moss and wild fragrant flowers on the air. She climbed out of her truck and trotted over towards the creature that lay in the middle of the road. It was a doe. It looked affrighted, and something seemed to be hanging out of its side. Julia closed her eyes tightly. Please God, she thought, thinking that the doe's innards were sticking out of the creature, and it was likely to suffer a slow, excruciating, painful death, all because she decided to take a drive on a whim tonight. She cursed herself for her foolishness. "I'm sorry, little one. Are you all right?" "Sorry. Silly question to ask. You're not all right, are you? That makes two of us. But your condition is far worse than mine. What have I done to you? I'm so sorry. You came out of nowhere. I didn't see you. I wasn't able to stop in time." Julia stands on the road, remaining still, wondering what she could do to help this doe. There was no way she was going to get a stone to put her out of her misery. She just couldn't do that. All of a sudden, Julia hears a pair of ponderous, heavy feet pounding through the trees, snapping twigs, crunching crisp leaves, breaking foliage. Whatever is moving towards her is thunderously fast and furious, like a roaring, unquenchable wind. And then under the magnanimous illumination of the ethereal full moon that casts her gentle silvery shadows across the road, she sees it. She gasps when she finds herself staring at a Herculean-sized Bigfoot that emerges from the fringe of the trees. At first it looked like a huge, ambiguous, indecipherable black blob, but as it approaches her, she was in no doubt what her eyes were actually beholding. This she did not expect to see in a million years. This was not a moment she would have anticipated would ever mark the calendar of her life. She didn't even believe Bigfoots existed until now. Now her view of the natural world has undergone an instantaneous, dramatic transformation. It has to shift when you encounter an incredulous, lofty creature like this. Julia is far too flabbergasted to entertain any fear. It has been overtaken by a natural, inquisitive curiosity. The Bigfoot is female. She has a matriarch energy and long, sagging breasts like pockets. She doesn't appear to notice Julia. Her attention is completely devoted to the doe, as if she genuinely cares about this creature's well-being, which is a surprise to Julia. The Bigfoot is behaving like an EMT, examining a roadside victim as she hurries to the doe's side. She's about 7 foot and 600 pounds, covered in long flowing charcoal-coloured hair that is speckled with grey roots. She has a feminine face with very high cheekbones, a leathery grey skin, and a heavily furrowed forehead. The Bigfoot is on her knees. She hovers over the doe. The strange thing is the doe seems comforted and reassured by her presence, which, of course, Julia finds strange. Her hands begin to tug at something to the rear of the doe, and before Julia's eyes, she discovers the doe has actually just given birth in the middle of the road to a baby fawn. The mother doe suddenly seems to bounce out of her affrighted state when she realizes the little fawn has been born with the help of a Bigfoot. She begins to lick the fawn all over, while the Bigfoot seems to be calming her down with her soothing words. She appears to be speaking in a foreign language that Julia is not familiar with.
Inati, hotsotona vinagana, ilasi lo shasi, homosilani, amasi fonopo. The doe that at first was traumatized appears to stagger awkwardly onto her feet, as if the Bigfoot words have somehow brought her a sense of calm, that also seems to have tranquilized Julia's flustered state, as she feels an undescribable peace flow over her like an ocean wave of reassurance. She has never felt that kind of peace overcome her before, which she was later to describe as an outer-worldly, godlike experience. Is the doe going to be all right? Julia finds herself asking the Bigfoot. The creature had seemed so human. It was the most natural thing in the world to talk to her. I'm worried. You see, I felt a bump. I think I might have harmed the mother. The Bigfoot looks up at Julia, as if seeing her for the first time. Her deep-set eyes meet Julia's worried ones. She's a first-time mother, said the Bigfoot. Isafokotolani. She was about to give birth. She was crossing the road into the meadow over there. They like to give birth in the meadow, you see. She must have had a shock when you bumped into her. But you were driving slowly. No harm done. It was a little bump, but she was shocked, and so I knew she needed help in the delivery. I knew she'd be giving birth soon. She was wearing the birthing energy, the white light of another soul. Isiponi, hanonokolomani, aginasinadon, ha safolobase, illusionowan, agilamono. Julia was surprised that the creature was talking to her in a language that was being translated directly into her head, and her interaction with the creature seemed like the most natural thing in the world. The Bigfoot female points at Julia's belly. Oh, poti, hasafolobona. I see you've got 6 months still to go, she says, pointing at her belly. Mortalina, homogila. You're having a boy, I see. Hitina po. He can't wait to be born. He's a bit impatient. Some are like that, you know. They can't wait to get here. You know I'm pregnant, gasped Julia. How can you possibly know that? I know things, said the Bigfoot. I see energy, you see. That's why I knew the mother doe here was about to give birth. I can see the white light on your belly. I can tell the soul is 3 months old. All of a sudden, the little fawn, whom had struggled for 15 minutes to rise up on its unstable, wobbling legs, stood up next to its mother and crossed the road with her. They bounded towards the meadow. She's forgotten you bumped her, said the Bigfoot. That's a mother's love for you. A mother's love can overcome all adversity and conquer everything. Julia would never forget those prophetic, memorable words. A mother's love can overcome adversity and conquer everything. She's tired, said the Bigfoot. Giving birth isn't easy. She'll be taking some time to rest in the meadow, but then again you'll know about that soon. The Bigfoot points to her belly again. He motalana bana Ross, she said. He wants to be called Ross. Who wants to be called Ross? Your baby, of course, said the Bigfoot. Who do you think I was talking about? She paused for a moment and said, Ikalambono, hamafagana sibodo, asilono bojana, iloko bolo. It's nice to meet you. My job is done. The doe and her fawn are absolutely fine. I need to go now. My own little one needs me. And then with an incredible grace, she floated away and moved towards the trees until she was gone. And the first thing that entered Julia's mind was, did that really just happen? 6 months later.
Oh, he's a beauty, said Jack, taking his baby in his arms. To think I didn't want you, little one. What was I thinking? You're the most perfect 7-pound little bundle I ever did see.
You weren't thinking, were you, Jack? Said Julia, giggling.
I was a complete idiot. I'm the luckiest man in the world to have such a beautiful wife and such a wonderful baby, he said, walking over to Julia to give his wife a big kiss. My life was forever changed when I met the RainGirl. You know something, little one, he says, bobbing his baby in his arms. Good job your mother's a forgiving woman. Otherwise your daddy might be in the dog box. But be careful you don't get in there yourself, young one. I better warn you about that. Your mummy loves to throw meatballs and spaghetti around at random." "With good reason," said Julia. "With very good reason. Now the big question is, what do we call him, RainGirl?" "His name is Ross." The baby began to gurgle with delight at the sound of his name. "Oh, I do believe our little boy likes the sound of his name." "Of course he does," chuckled Julia. "He chose it after all." "What do you mean he chose it, RainGirl?" asked her husband incredulously. "I'll tell you the story one day, but not now. I'm far too exhausted for that." So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rachel and I'm from Atlanta, which is a bustling, vibrant, diverse city situated among the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains at 1,050 feet above sea level, which is the highest elevation among major cities east of the Mississippi River. It is often referred to as the Big Peach, or the City in the Forest, and is the capital and most populated city in the state of Georgia. I happily reside here in a leafy green neighborhood where I live in a very attractive area north of downtown Atlanta known as Chastain Park with my fun-loving parents and my studious older brother Neil. We live in an elegantly restored old Tudor-style home with a very sizable front and back yard, which is lined with sumptuous green turf, a scattering of pretty trees, and a few colourful flower beds filled with seasonal flowers. My strange, rather incredulous, outlandish Bigfoot story begins in a way that I never imagined possible. For indeed, I never considered that a Bigfoot story would ever cross my path, and certainly not in the way that it did. As invariably you always assume that a Bigfoot encounter is rather like the lottery, which means I never thought I would actually hit the jackpot myself. Well, certainly not in quite the way that I did. It all began when the COVID-19 pandemic broke around the world, which made my mother become unduly alarmed about my grandmother, who was in her 80s. At the time, she'd been living in a residential care home where a few people had suddenly just died from COVID. My mother thought that my grandmother might be predisposed and vulnerable to the virus given her age, fragility and weakened immune system, which was why she was desirous for her to move into our house forthwith, an idea that was exceedingly unbecoming to my father, who became very aggrieved and indignant about such a horrifying prospect. For a while, our normally tranquil, peace-loving home became rather like a war zone, where the verbal battles ensued in our sofa-covered living room and carpeted home, as my parents argued incessantly. My obstinate, pertinacious mother invariably always seemed to get her way in the end, and so for a couple of days our house descended into darkness as my sullen father sulked in the corner, barely saying a single word, while my mother prepared the spare room on the first floor of our home for my elderly grandmother Ruth. Within 2 days, she'd moved into our home. My grandmother Ruth is a very sweet, frail, elderly woman who's actually as sharp as a hawk and incredibly observant. Yet at the same time, she's as gentle as a doe. I've always warmed to her because she is such a gentle, warm-hearted and congenial sort of person, and yet at the very same time, humorous as well. I remember when I was helping her unpack in her bedroom, she actually said to me, "Oh, I hope I'm not going to be an inconvenience for you all. I can see that your father isn't very happy to have me around, and I can't say I really blame him for that. This is all very awkward for all of us." "Don't worry about him, Granny," I said, giving her a reassuring hug. "Dad's just very set in his ways, that's all. He finds it rather difficult to adjust to different living circumstances. I wouldn't worry about it at all if I was you. He just needs to acclimatise to having you around, and once he's adjusted, he'll be fine, I promise you of that. I know what he's like." "Oh, I hope you're right," chided my grandmother, looking more than a little doubtful. I began to help my grandmother unpack, while she sat back on a comfortable chair watching me and directing me as to where to put her various things. Before long, I was placing her neatly folded clothes into various drawers and hanging up all her pretty dresses and coats. I was about to put this long cardboard box into the cupboard when I discerned that it was full of these most magnificent drawings. "Granny," I said in shock, putting the box onto the bed and going through the pictures in awe. "These pictures are
absolutely incredible. The colours are marvellous, and the drawings are exquisite. Did you draw these? I asked. They're stunning. Yes, I did. When I was a young girl. Well, some of them anyway. Not all of them. I never knew you were an artist, I said, sifting through the pictures very briefly. You certainly know how to keep your light hidden under a bushel, Granny. You're a real talent, if ever I saw one. My grandmother chuckled. That's very kind of you to say so, dear. In those days I enjoyed drawing a great deal. I was a young girl then. It was one thing I could always do that didn't break the bank for my family. We were very poor back then. I sat down on the bed in my grandmother's bedroom and glanced through the pictures very briefly that she had drawn. Some were of her home, the pretty countryside, and even her family. And then there was another picture that caused the hair on the back of my head to stand on end, and my eyes to grow round as saucers, and my jaw to drop to the ground. My grandmother had drawn the perfect picture of a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. How could she even have known about such a creature, I pondered. I was absolutely stumped. What's wrong, dear? She asked, her voice expressing concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. Your skin has grown as white as a sheet. Granny, I said, waving the picture of the Bigfoot towards her. What's this that you've drawn here? My grandmother giggled. Oh, that's Mops. Well, that's what my mother used to call him when I was growing up, because his rag-tailed hair looked like a mop. It was long and shaggy. He was a funny old thing, really. You mean you knew this creature? I asked, looking absolutely amazed. I sat down on her bed and insisted my grandmother told me the entire story from start to finish. So this is what she told me in her own words, which I now reveal to you. Well, dear, she proceeded to tell me, I grew up in the late Depression in the Appalachian, Kentucky area that stretches from Alabama to southern Pennsylvania. It was in the 1930s, and those grueling times were very hard indeed for the all of us, as there was very little employment back then due to the 1929 stock market crash, inexperienced Federal Reserve, and ill-timed tariffs, all collectively contributing to the ailing economy at the time. In those days we had to be very diligent and prudent and learn to survive, and that's what we did back then. We industrially grew our own vegetables and bottled and preserved them for the winter months. We raised chickens for eggs and we had a goat for milk. You really didn't have a choice in the matter, even if you wanted to. We were very frugal in those days, and we had a saying, use it up, wear it out, make do or go without. As a child, I'd scamper around the open wilderness in my bare feet, as shoes then were so expensive and my parents couldn't afford to buy me any. I never owned a pair of my own for a very long time. I would end up getting bitten by insects or spiky thorns would get embedded into my feet. But one day my father used the skins from a dead animal to make me a pair of boots, and that changed my life for the better, as he was a very resourceful man, and I still say to this very day that those boots were the very best I've ever owned. Even though things were very tough and Spartan in those days, I had a beautiful, idyllic and magical childhood. And when you're young and innocent, you believe that the thrifty, provident way that you live is perfectly normal, because you don't know any better. You think that being frugal and penny-wise is the natural way to survive. Not like it is today, dear, where there is just so much wastage in absolutely everything. It wasn't like that then. In those days we lived on meagre scant offerings, and we would eat potatoes with onions and hot dogs to fill up, or other cheap foods like beans, brown rice, oats and canned tuna or salmon, or sometimes mac and cheese. I remember one of my favourite foods was biscuits with creamed salmon. We lived in a very small rustic wooden cabin where we shared one queen-size bed together, which was occupied by both of my parents, my older brother Larry, and then me, of course. We would all have to squeeze together in one bed, but during the winter months it was very snug because we would keep each other incredibly warm. As a kid, I loved playing in the wilderness, the vast open prairies, the streams and the heavily wooded areas on our land. Growing up, Mops was a very normal part of my young life, and I played with him all the time. Of course, he was physically different to me, but when you're young, you accept people at face value and respect them the way they are, without considering their physical differences as strange or peculiar. Indeed, I never thought of such matters in regards to Mops. Granted, he was covered in long flowing brown hair, and he had feet that were padded at the bottom like a cat's, which I used to envy because he'd never get thorns in his feet or anything like that. He was able to run over the rough terrain and even on the snow with ease without getting his feet all cold. He was a creature of few words, but that really didn't matter to me. But he did speak to his mother in a chattering language, which I always found incredibly funny. When I was 10 years old, Mops was already about 5 foot tall and very heavy and stockily built. Not that that ever bothered me at the time. His height or his size was never an issue for me. Sometimes his height was a huge advantage for me, because he could reach the fruit on the trees that I couldn't get to, like peaches and apples, which was great, or biscuits that my mother had hidden from us on the top shelf of the pantry. We would play hide and seek, and Mops could hide in plain sight, and I'd never be able to find him. He was great at just vanishing into thin air, and he loved it when I couldn't discover his hiding spot. It used to drive me completely potty, so eventually he made himself a little easier to find, or I'd have given up on that game in a heartbeat. Yes, but I don't understand is how Mops just became a part of your family and your life in the first place. Well, that's another story, dear. I must have been about 2 years old, and my mother had placed me in a playpen outside my quaint little rustic cabin. It was like a fenced-in area that my father had made out of wooden pegs to keep me contained. In those days they could not afford toys, but my parents would put pine cones into the playpen and interesting pieces of driftwood, along with paper and crayons for me to play with, and I would be entertained while my mother cleaned out the house, always keeping her steely eyes pinned on me. One day when my mother came out into the yard to attend to my needs, she discovered little Mops had been placed in the playpen next to me. We were playing together very happily, like a couple of naughty juvenile toddlers, although Mops was physically bigger than me at the time. My mother was rather surprised and bewildered to see Mops in the playpen, and she wisely speculated that he was indeed the child of the wild woman, and instinctively sensed she needed her to babysit Mops, so that's exactly what she did. The wild woman would come and collect Mops later in the day, although she was never observed doing so by my mother. I think my mother was secretly pleased that I had a companion to play with, which meant I would get up to less mischief and was kept preoccupied by my little friend. I do remember she scrubbed Mops down a few times with a scrubbing brush and plenty of soap, and brushed out all the knots in his hair with a hairbrush, and he screamed blue murder like a baby because it hurt so much when my mother worked on all those tangles of his. After that fiasco, Mops was always wary of my mother, and when she came after him with a hairbrush, he would run and hide. He was so terrified of that thing, and if he saw a hairbrush, he would start to tremble and wobble like a jelly. If my mother ever wanted Mops to leave the house, all she had to do was wave that hairbrush at him, and he would vanish from sight, and we wouldn't see him for the rest of the day. Every time she upset Mops, he would spray the wall like a domestic cat in revenge and leave the most pungent odour behind in our house that would literally burn the back of your throats and hurt your eyes. It was a putrid smell, rather like hot garbage, and my mother hated it. Did your mother know this wild woman? I asked. No, you see, the introverted wild woman was very reticent, evasive and bashful, but my mother had seen her in passing in the wood green, and their eyes met on many occasions. I think she liked the timorous wild woman and understood her diffidence better than most. You see, growing up, my mother herself had been painfully shy, so she rarely related to the demure wild woman. I know she spotted her capricious elderly partner once or twice in the forest, whom she described as a very sizable, fractious old fellow, whom she believed was a little cantankerous, grouchy and rather moody. You could tell he was old, as his grey hair was turning white, and his leathery, weathered grey face looked literally ancient and shrivelled up like a wizened old tortoise. That was how wrinkled he was. She perceived that the wild woman brought Mops to play with me so that his mischievous games and animated high-pitched whoops would not upset and unnerve the cranky, crotchety old fellow. I do remember when I was playing in the sylvan with Mops, the crusty old fellow heard us as we were chasing each other around the grove. I was shrieking wildly with laughter, and Mops was whooping in delight because he perceived that I'd never catch him, as Mops could run like the wind. I've never seen anything that could run that fast. I will never forget the petulant old fellow who'd been watching us sternly with angry eyes. He lunged towards me, shaking his gargantuan fists at me in a furious rage, and he began to scream so loudly that he sounded like a woman being murdered. Then he curled back his lips and unleashed the most terrifying growl and leered at me with his hostile eyes. I could tell that he was incandescent with rage, which caused my whole body to shake like a leaf. I was certain in that moment that the quick-tempered old man was about to hit me really hard, but that was when the unassuming wild woman came to my immediate rescue. She ushered the old man away, talking to him very softly in a chattering tone that seemed to calm him down. I always got the impression that Mops kept a safe distance from the narky old fellow, as I think he was fickle at the very best of times. He was a scary individual. He was thickly built like an army tank, and was easily over 8 foot tall and even more than 700 pounds, and possibly 3 foot wide. Over the years, the magnanimous wild woman brought my family generous open-handed gifts of deers, hogs, rabbits, fish, and other food sources in exchange for taking care of Mops. We would discover these bountiful trophies on our front door, along with a bucket of wild berries or fruits from time to time, which my mother would bottle or make into delicious jams. As far as my parents were concerned, looking after Mops was a lifesaver for our family. It was like earning a very decent, highly desirable wage package, because it meant we had meat every single day of our lives, which alleviated our hunger pangs and satiated us considerably. It would seem that life became a great deal better and easier for us in our home, because we all went to bed with full satisfied stomachs, thanks to the wild woman, and we were healthier too. My father, whom had never been best pleased about my relationship with Mops and thought it was a bit unusual, shut up after the meat kept arriving on our doorstep, let me tell you that. Whereabouts did Mops live, I asked. Well, he lived in the woods in a cave with his mother and dad. I remember he showed me the place once when we were playing in the grove. You would never have known it was even there. It was concealed by thick brush and thicket, and it was fully protected from all the elements. It was a cosy, sumptuous den, lined with lots of animal pelts and tree stumps and so forth. So how long were you friends with Mops, I asked. I think I was about 12 years old when Mops and his mother went away to pastures new, because they were, like nomads, following waterways, railway lines and animal trails, as that's how the wild men in those days lived. I think the only reason they stayed in our vicinity for so long is because of the grumpy old man, who was tired and weary and incapacitated by his leg that appeared to give him a great deal of trouble. He would drag it on the ground behind him. My mother believed it had once been caught in a trap before and had given him a great deal of grief ever since. She thought that he might have insufferable pain, which could have accounted for his volatile temper. Of course, when he died, everything changed after that. It was a very sad, grievous time for the all of us. Even my father missed the free meat deliveries at our front doorstep, and life went downhill from then on, as we had to resort to living on beans and rice, and it wasn't easy, let me tell you. How did the old man die? I asked. Well, I remember one day the wild woman beckoned to my mother and indicated for her to follow her, which was a very big deal for us because she was desperately shy, and although she would make her presence known, she liked to remain hidden in the shadows. We barely ever saw her unless she crossed our path and glanced at us ever so briefly. On this occasion, however, the wild woman stepped out of her comfort zone, which wasn't easy for her at all, and she led my mother to the open grave that she had dug in the grove, only yards away from where the cave was where the family lived. I remember getting such a shock when I observed the old man lying next to the open grave, with his deceased body. It was so withered. I could see that despite his great size and girth, he was emaciated and drawn. I'd never seen a dead body before that, and in my eyes he was very human to me, despite all the hair and his gargantuan size. I must say he looked very peaceful in death. My mother believed he'd died in his sleep or something, and you could see that the wild woman loved him so very much. I could discern the distress in her eyes, and how desperately sad she was. I remember my mother took the wild woman into her arms, and they locked in a warm embrace. She patted her gently on her hair-covered back, and she kept saying, "I'm so sorry, you poor, poor thing. It must be very hard for the both of you." The wild woman really looked comforted by my mother's kind, gentle words and the compassion that she showed her. I could tell that she loved my mother very much, even though they had so little contact. She patted my mother's back as well. It was an emotional, loving embrace. Was Mop sad about his dad's death? No, not really. I think he was actually rather relieved, to tell you the truth. I sensed his fractious relationship with his father was combustible at the very best of times. I think the poor old man possibly found Mops rather too rambunctious and feisty for his liking. So what happened next? Well, the wild woman buried the old man while we all watched the procedure. It was really rather peculiar, but she wanted to include us in the ceremony, and I realised then that she considered us a huge part of her life, which was incredibly moving, especially for my mother, who was touched to the quick. I noticed Mama was actually crying when the old man was buried. I think she was so sad for the wild woman. Once the old man was buried, the wild woman put some sticks into the ground to mark the grave, and then she let out the most appallingly loud howls. I even began to weep when she howled, because you could feel her desperate pain. And then once she'd finished grieving, she pointed towards the east, and my mother knew that they were leaving and moving on. We were all grievously sad, and said our goodbyes. I remember we patted each other on the backs and nodded, and I just wept and wept when I saw them go. It really felt like a death and a dreadful loss. I was so sad. I remember after they left, life got really hard again. Obviously, we no longer had the meat deliveries from the wild woman, and I missed Mop so much. He had been my very best friend growing up. I never stopped crying for days. I used to beg God to bring him back to us, but he and his mother, they never returned. I begged God to make them return, but it just never happened. My mother believed that the wild woman, who was still very young at the time, had possibly found a new love. My mother was so sad. She told me she never realised how much the wild people had impacted her life. We always went to the grave of the old man and prayed for him and laid down flowers for him on the anniversary of his death every single year. Wow, I said, what a story! I said this looking at the picture my gran had painted of the critter with a pyramid-shaped head, overlong arms and hair-covered body. As my grandmother looked at the picture, I could see the tears welling in her eyes and streaking and falling down her cheeks as she remembered little Mops. So this is Mops, I said, studying the picture. It's a really good picture. He looks really sweet. His eyes look very kind. My grandmother was still crying, wiping away her tears. Oh, he was kind, she said, very kind. And if you think that's a good picture, she said, look at these. My grandmother showed me some other pictures that had been meticulously done by a fine artist. Who did these? These were done by Mops. Mops drew these pictures? I asked in astonishment. My grandmother nodded. He was a great artist, and we would draw together for hours. He was far better than me. He knew how to draw the natural world. You see, he knew it so much better than I did. That's extraordinary, I said. He was such a phenomenal artist. I can't believe it. Suddenly I remembered the picture from the Patterson-Gimlin footage, and I took out my mobile phone and showed the footage to my grandmother. I wanted to see what she thought of the creature that many have speculated for so long and wondered if it was real. What do you think of this footage, Granny? I asked. That looks a lot like the wild woman, said my grandmother, only she was much taller and slimmer. But she did look like that. It's a great footage, she said, and it's definitely real. It's not fake. You can see the muscles moving under the arms, and you can see the areas where the animal doesn't have hair. That was similar to the wild woman. As you can imagine, I was thrilled that my grandmother could share this story with me, and if she had not stayed in our home, I would never have known about her encounter with the hairy man. I told my grandmother that the critters are known as Bigfoot, but she said Mops and the wild woman were like people to her, but people with hair and pyramid-shaped faces and very powerful, strong bodies. But they're just like us, she told us, with emotions and feelings. Don't ever forget that. You cannot say they're animals because they're intelligent and discerning. I did tell her that some people had terrifying encounters with the critters, and she believes that they are actually misunderstood. They do have an intrinsic ability to read your mind, she did tell me. I do know Mops was always able to know what I was thinking. And that was proven one day when we played a game where I'd draw a picture on a piece of paper and he had to guess what I'd drawn. And he always got it right. If I drew an apple or a house, he drew exactly what I'd drawn. So he was very, very telepathic. I imagine if a hunter was thinking I'm going to kill this wild man, he would be in pretty much big trouble, because the wild man would already have perceived his thoughts and quickly defend himself. Also, if you display fear, that would be a red flag to a wild man. You see, the wild man would see your fear as an invitation to attack, as all the other animals they hunt are afraid of them as well. But do you believe that there are bad wild men? Of course I do, just as there are bad men in our world. It really is not much different than that. The problem is if you're dealing with an aggressive wild man, you'll be in big trouble because they're colossal, dangerous, and they'll kill you in a heartbeat. My grandmother still lives in our house to this day, and my father has warmed to her considerably because she's a very likeable old lady. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Katrina, and I was born and raised in Charleston, West Virginia. When I was 25 in 1978, I fell passionately in love with a debonair, handsome, rugged and easygoing man called Cole, who actually was a cattle rancher. Anyone will tell you that if you're beguiled and bedazzled by a rancher, you also need to ingratiate yourself towards the quintessential rural, provincial, rustic lifestyle. You'll invariably also have to cherish horses and cows because they become such an intrinsic part of your daily life in the running and managing of a ranch. Luckily for me, I've always been an impassioned animal lover with a wholehearted, zealous and spirited affinity for the natural world, always preferring to be out of doors, spending time in nature, and not concerning myself with fancy hairstyles, loads of makeup and fashionable clothes. Instead, I like to wear a cowgirl hat, a pair of jeans, a plaid shirt, and a pair of cowboy boots, and I'm pretty much as happy as a dog rolling around in the mud. I like living in a relaxed, easygoing way. When Cole and I were married, I immediately moved into his huge ranch-style home that had previously belonged to his father, who was now a retired rancher, and was living in the coast in Oregon with his beautiful wife Mona. Our prepossessing, rather swanky-looking home was nestled in the heart of an exquisite-looking valley, surrounded by undulating green hills, mountainous valleys, grazing pastures, white wooden poled fences, a pond, a creek, 3 barns, and ubiquitous trees scattered liberally across the picturesque, bodacious landscape. It would seem that I settled down to an idyllic Elysian country life, rather like a duck to water, whilst managing the domestic priorities like cleaning, cooking and shopping. I received a great deal of gratification helping my husband Cole around his ranch, with mucking out of the stables, grooming and exercising the horses, as well as interacting with the cows. My inscrutable, rather incongruous story begins when I decided to take my 2 beloved golden retrievers, Eskimo Pie and Poochie Pie, for their daily walks by a local lake in an area teeming with ducks and waterfowl. It was a very serene, tranquil oasis, bounded by acres of rolling green turf, plentiful trees and countless walking trails. Cole thought I was crazy to indulge my dogs in this extravagant way, and was insistent that our large ranch was sufficiently sizable and ample enough for our 2 energetic, very rambunctious, high-spirited retrievers for them to run around and explore. While this was indeed true, it was never ever about the space, as that wasn't an issue for me at all. I was determined that both my dogs were well socialised with other dogs, but I also secretly enjoyed meeting up with some of my girlfriends. I loved sitting on the wooden benches and talking while we watched our rollicking dogs go diving into the water, retrieving sticks and running around happily while they played with all kinds of other dogs, from beagles, poodles, collies, Great Danes, pinchers, bull terriers, you name it, so much more. Any bystander would wisely perceive that this social interaction for the dogs was terribly significant, but it was also a pleasant escape for me to engage in some light-hearted banter with my girlfriends, as in those days we didn't have the social media platforms that they invariably have today, where people can connect together. On this particular day I vividly recall arriving at the lake earlier than usual, and opening the trunk to let out my boisterous golden retrievers, who were hyped up, energised and very excited, as much like any dog, they always appreciated a trip away from home. Before long they were bounding exuberantly along the lush green grass, smelling the ground furiously and lifting their leg at every available opportunity to make their distinctive life-affirming mark. I was bewildered that there were not many dogs or people around, but maybe it was because it was particularly early. It was a glorious day with some lovely warm sunshine and a refreshing cool breeze that was blowing against my face. Everything looked beguiling and magically enchanting as the large silvery lake seemed to sparkle in the morning sun, and its gleaming surface reflected the clouds in the sky along with the tall statuesque trees that flanked its outer perimeters. "Hi there," chided Philippa, one of my girlfriends that I'd known for many years. She came ambling towards me with her two friendly, rather peppy Jack Russells, who came hurtling towards my dogs at lightning speed, only too eager to greet them, with lots of sniffing and very vigorous tail wagging. "I've not seen you around lately. How are things going at the ranch with that new husband of yours? That was some wedding, by the way." "Oh, fine," I said. "Everything's hunky-dory." "Well, I see ranch life suits you rather well," she chuckled. "You seem to be positively glowing. But who can blame you? You snagged yourself one hell of a catch with that rancher husband of yours. He's so attractive and good-looking, with a great sense of humour, I might add." "Thanks a lot," I said. "I know he is. I am very lucky." "Something's up with my dogs today," said Philippa, referring to her two boisterous Jack Russells that liked to chase everything in sight and were pretty fearless. "What do you mean?" I asked. "They look perfectly fine to me." "Well, they're fine now, but you should have seen them earlier on. They behaved very weird. We were rambling around the Sylvan," she said, "and they weren't acting right. They were skittish and spasmodic and fearful. It was exceedingly odd. I've never seen them like this before. They couldn't actually wait to leave the woods. Normally it's their favourite part of the walk, but certainly not today." "That's weird," I admitted. "I've never known your Jack Russells to be frightened of anything. I wonder what got them so spooked." "I think there's something in the woods there," said Philippa, lowering her voice to a silent whisper. "I know it sounds odd, but I really thought something was exceedingly off. I got the awful sense that somebody was watching me. It was so ominous and disquieting. It gave me the heebie-jeebies. I've never felt so unsettled before." "Well, maybe it was a vagrant," I suggested. "He was possibly just spying on you." "Of course you're right," said Philippa. "That must be it," she said, looking heartily relieved, as if in some way I'd reassured her. "But whoever he was, I will tell you this, he freaked my dogs out, and they didn't like him one little bit, because Biscuit here kept growling, and she does not get aggressive. She hasn't got a nasty bone in that body of hers." I didn't even give Philippa's concerns a moment's thought, as I had known her for many years. She was recognised in town for being a hypochondriac that literally overreacted to just about everything. If she had a cold, she had pneumonia. If she sprained her ankle, she believed that she had become crippled for life. I remember one time she cut herself with a kitchen knife, barely even grazing her skin, but she firmly believed that she was bleeding to death. I had to drive her to hospital at lightning speed, and she howled the entire way like a great big baby. I was hardly about to take anything she said seriously, because whatever she professed was almost certainly to be highly exaggerated. I bid her farewell and went on my merry way, venturing towards the pristine silvery lake, where I indulged my dogs' hearty expectations and threw a few sticks in the lake for them to fetch. Before long they were shaking their long shaggy coats and spraying my jeans with water. We then trekked towards the Sylvan. I love this part of the walk best, because the hiking trails are so phenomenal and are well maintained by the Forestry Commission, and the statuesque trees with their colossal trunks literally tower into the sky like resplendent-looking giants, with their emerald leafy heads providing a sumptuous canopy above us, which allowed the mellow, subdued and gentle shafts of sunlight to dance through the branches. The forest floor was adorned with lacy leaves of delicate ferns and flowering creepers. As I entered this heavenly wooded sanctuary, I surmised that Philippa was actually right. Why had I been so quick to dismiss her claims? There was something distinctly off about the woods this morning, and it was sending chills down my spine and making me feel very discomposed. I suddenly realised how insanely quiet everything had become. I perceived that the woods were devoid of the usual musical tweets and warbles from the pretty bird song. I had actually once heard my father claim that if everything became very still in a woods, it could mean that a predator was lurking around furtively in the shadows, waiting to pounce on its unsuspecting prey. This horrifying revelation did not bode well with me, and only sparked in me an amplified sense of consternation. So I reached out for a piece of timber as a precautionary measure, should I need to defend myself from some loitering predator, like a mountain lion or something else. It was oddly reassuring and comforting to see that my ecstatic, jubilant, rambunctious dogs were seemingly unfazed. They were zooming down the hiking trails, sniffing the ground attentively, as if they were in heaven. It seemed that some kind of intoxicating, alluring scent had really enthralled them and got their immediate attention. They ran far ahead of me, abandoning me way ahead on the trail. "Come back now, Eskimo Pie," I called. "Come back now!" But it was to no avail, and my dog ignored my frantic, persistent calls. I really hated it when they did this to me. I knew when my dogs encountered a thrilling scent, all their obedience training went flying out of the window and was quickly forgotten and unlearnt. I sighed in frustration and continued to walk. In a trice, I really sensed that something supremely sinister and insidious was staring at me. It was a menacing, inauspicious feeling. I frantically looked around the wood and saw nothing there. I can't describe this creepy, baleful feeling to you, only that it was causing my heart to pump violently in my chest. My face began to break out in a cold sweat. In the wind, I caught a whiff of the most awful odour that reminded me of hot, sweaty trash that had gone rancid. Perhaps there really was a smelly, unkept vagabond camped out here in the woods, I thought, after all. That was when I heard this dismaying, pugnacious, low guttural growl. It was unlike anything I've ever heard before. My primal gut instinct was to run out of the sylvan as fast as I possibly could, but my dogs were further up the trail, and I just could not abandon them like that. It was then that I noticed some small saplings swaying menacingly backwards and forwards, but this was not an action caused by a gentle breeze. Of that I was assured. That was when I discerned a dark silhouette moving between the brush. I could see an ominous shadowy outline that looked rather like a bear, but I knew instinctively that this was no bear. What on earth was it, I wondered? Then I saw him as he pulled back the verdant undergrowth like a large shower curtain. He stood there brewing for a moment, leering at me with his savage, deep-set black eyes. Then he came charging out of the thicket, thundering towards me like an incensed, raging bull that was volatile, antagonistic, and explosive. I was in absolute shock. I couldn't believe what I was discerning with my eyes. It was like the obnoxious, cold-blooded monster on the pages of pulp fiction had suddenly taken on bodily form and become alive, entering our reality. Words cannot do justice in expressing the escalating, portentous terror I felt in those vital seconds. I stood there, completely frozen to the spot. If I was desirous to run, I could not have done so. It was like my whole body just disengaged and shut down, failing brilliantly to cooperate with my woolly brain. My mind kept screaming, "Run! Girl, run, run!" But I simply could not move a muscle. I'd seemingly grown incapacitated and paralysed by the most overwhelming sense of impending dread. I had become like a pathetic ready meal waiting to be served up to a hungry predator without putting on any resistance whatsoever. I even dropped the timber stick that I'd been holding for the self-defence that I'd planned, because fighting this creature off would ultimately seal my destined deadly fate, without a shadow of a doubt. What on earth was wrong with me, I wondered. I was living on borrowed time, and my life was flashing before me. And yet I was just standing there like a lumbering idiot, unable to move. I assumed I was already foredoomed, pretty much dead. Well, I would be in any second, and that condemning thought hit me like a ton of bricks. But I still could not move a muscle. The voracious creature was standing yards away from me. He began pounding his chest defiantly, as if to establish his dominance and authority over me. It was like he was ridden with testosterone. It was almost as if he was saying, "This is my territory, and I don't want you in here." I stared at this thing with terrified eyes that grew as wide as saucers, and I began to tremble like a jelly. This audacious creature was demoniacal in appearance and seemed malevolent and evil. Everything about him made my skin crawl, as he was quite literally the most treacherously dangerous beast that I have ever encountered in my entire life. Truly, I would have been more comfortable and at ease in the presence of an aggressive lion than this hideously grotesque, virtuous being that with one strike from his hand could swat me dead, much like an annoying fly. What on earth was he, I wondered? It would seem that he was humanoid with very distinctive ape-like influences to his appearance, but it was hard to discriminate one from another. The critter stood on 2 feet, at easily over 8 foot tall. His titanic-sized body was powerful, majestic, lofty, and very strong. If you had told me he was bulletproof, I would definitely have believed you. This thing, whatever on God's earth it was, exuded immense power and was built like a solid, hefty machine. Every part of this creature's body was densely thick with sinewy muscular definition, most especially his ample upper torso, not to mention his gargantuan-sized shoulders that were exceedingly impressive. I noticed he possessed a bullet-shaped head that blended seamlessly into the shoulders, and I did not discern a neck. The creature had very long arms that hung well below the knees, and very long, lean legs. He was covered from head to toe with long, shaggy, raven-coloured hair, and he had an oval face with a masculine, very square jawline, a prominent, deeply furrowed brow, and very wide, flat nose, and deep-set black eyes that were hostile, cold, and exceedingly threatening. I watched in absolute horror as the critter continued to thump his chest with his powerful fists, as though he was beating a drum. Indeed, it sounded like that. He began to growl at me, curling his lips back to expose his sizable human-like teeth. Suddenly the critter was momentarily distracted by the unexpected spontaneous appearance of both of my dogs that came bounding past us, barely giving me a second glance. Eskimo Boy's fixed gaze was on Poochie Pie, who had her mouth clammed down tightly, much like an oyster shell, over the trophy that she was carrying in her mouth. Eskimo Boy clearly wanted to pilferage it from her, whatever it was, but she was sprinting far ahead, disallowing Eskimo Boy to get even remotely close to her. So there she was, Poochie Pie, who had no intention of giving up her prize, and went tearing past me through the Sylvan with Eskimo Boy in hot pursuit of her, rather like a police officer chasing an offender. In that second, while the critter's distracted attention was focused on my dogs, I seized this golden opportunity to escape, and suddenly I found my legs again, with a surge of adrenaline, and I sprinted through the wood green as fast as a cheetah. I was terrified that this ghastly creature would chase us, but he didn't. I continued to run as fast as a bat out of hell, never stopping once to draw breath, not even for a moment, nor to even acknowledge any of my friends who had arrived at the lake to walk their dogs. I went tearing past them. I could actually hear them greeting me, but I didn't acknowledge them at all. I hastily opened the trunk for my dogs, and they jumped into the back, and I closed the door behind them as quickly as I could. I dived onto the car seat, started up the engine, and accelerated out of the car park, so fast, while I could see my friends looking on with astonished faces that conveyed what they were clearly thinking. What on earth is up with her? I could hear my dogs in the back of the car fighting continuously over the trophy that Poochie Pie had retrieved from the woods. I pulled over to the side of the road and finally parked. I was shaking so much that I had to calm myself down, or I knew I would crash my car and end up in a horrific, ghastly car accident. I had just escaped death once today. I was not in a hurry to face it all over again. I knew I needed to decompress, loosen up, relax, and calm down. I began to take some soothing deep breaths, breathing ever so deeply into a brown paper bag to settle my nerves and to regain some self-control. That thing could have killed me, I thought to myself. I'm so lucky to have escaped with my life still intact. Poochie Pie continued to growl at Eskimo Boy, so once I'd mellowed out, I went over to the back of the trunk and demanded that she drop whatever it was that she had in her mouth, but she was refusing to oblige and began growling even at me, which was simply not acceptable. I'd never seen her behave like this before. She seemed particularly possessive over what it was she had in her mouth. Poochie Pie was always picking up nasty, decomposing dead trophies from the woods, and I knew that she possibly had a disgusting dead rat in her mouth. But nothing was about to prepare me for what I was about to uncover in the next few seconds. "Drop it, Pooch! Drop it now! Now! Drop it!" I snapped in an angry tone that even surprised and startled her. Obediently she dropped the animal out of her mouth, and imagine my absolute astonishment when Pooch dropped a decomposing hand and wrist with a signet ring still attached to the tiny finger. I let out a huge scream as I observed the macabre, gruesome, chewed-up hand on the floor of my trunk. I began to hyperventilate in shock as a reaction to what I was seeing. Could this day get any worse, I wondered. Finally, I managed to simmer down, and wrinkling my nose in disgust, I reluctantly grabbed the gnarled, lifeless hand with a plastic glove and tossed it into a brown paper bag, much like a burger at a fast food joint, and rolled up the package ever so tightly. There are no words to describe how I was feeling at this point in time. It was disturbing, to say the least, to find a human hand embedded in my dog's mouth, but I was in no doubt who was responsible for dismembering this human being that I assumed must have been a lone dog walker who'd been violently attacked by the hideous, uncongenial monster that I had beheld. This could have been my hand, I thought in horror. I pressed down the accelerator and raced to the police station as fast as I possibly could. I needed to report this grisly murder at once and to present them with the incriminating evidence. As I entered the glass doors with my brown paper bag rolled up in my hand, I noticed the station was very quiet, apart from an elderly lady who was sitting on a chair waiting to see an officer about her nasty next-door neighbour, whom she believed emphatically had kidnapped and stolen her Persian cat. I raced to reception and insisted on seeing the chief inspector immediately on a matter of the strictest urgency. "You have to wait your turn, love, like everybody else," said the policeman behind the desk in a chilled-out, nonchalant way. "I'll call you when it's your turn. Take a seat." "I need to see the inspector now," I demanded. "I have to report a murder." Before long, I was being led into the inspector's office, and I sat there nervously, tapping my fingers on the desk and feeling rather apprehensive. Finally, a smart-looking, rather portly officer entered the room. "Sorry to keep you waiting, ma'am," said the officer. "I'm Detective Mathis. Pleased to meet you. How can I be of help with you this morning?" "I'm here to report a murder," I said, emptying out the paper bag containing the human hand onto the desk. Detective Mathis's eyes grew as wide as saucers, and he stared in astonishment at the gnarled, withered-looking hand on the table. For a moment he was completely speechless and didn't even say a word, but stared awkwardly at the hand, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was actually seeing. I'm not sure he was used to attaining evidence quite in this way. "Where did you get that?" he asked, looking rather flustered and discomposed. "I didn't get it," I told him. "My dog retrieved it when we went out on a walk in the woods this morning. I pulled it out of his mouth only moments ago in the trunk of the car." "I see," he said, rubbing his chin awkwardly as he studied the hand. "Detective," I continued, "I saw the murderer in the woods." "How do you know he's the murderer?" asked the detective. "Did you see him killing this man?" "No," I said, "but I know he did it. I could tell it was him." "Look, ma'am," said Detective Mathis, "I cannot charge anyone for a murder until I've done a thorough investigation, and I have evidence that the individual that you saw in the woods did indeed perpetrate the crime that you speak of. You have no idea how many murder inquiries I've done over the years with people like yourself telling me they know who did it, when they never saw a thing nor did they witness the murder. You cannot make erroneous charges and false allegations like this just because you assume he is guilty of this terrible crime. If indeed that were the case, I assure you, our prisons would be full of innocent men locked up because someone like you thought they were responsible for the crime. I operate on facts, ma'am, not on misguided, well-meaning assumptions and accusations. Officer, no buts, ma'am. I don't operate on buts. I assure you of that. I'll be getting the force to contain the forest area at once with crime scene tape. We'll then undertake a search with the help of police dogs to ascertain if the rest of the remains are still in the woods. We need to establish who the murder victim is, to notify their next of kin, and to perform a thorough investigation as to who potentially had motive to murder this man. But, officer, I protested, you don't understand what I'm trying to tell you. I know that this thing that murdered... I think I understand more than enough, ma'am, said the officer. Now I'd like you to sit down with the police artist for a moment and allow him to draw a sketch of the suspicious man you encountered in the woods. Leave your details in reception and I'll be in touch with you shortly. At that, he simply walked out of the office with the bag containing the human hand. I was shocked. It would seem like weeks had passed and I hadn't heard a thing from Detective Mathis, so I decided to find out what on earth was going on. I thought it exceedingly rude of Detective Mathis not to be in touch with me, especially as I had brought him incriminating evidence from the murder scene. I was surprised that he hadn't contacted me for further questioning, and I was naturally curious about whether they caught that ghastly critter that was lurking out there in the woods. After I arrived at the police station, Detective Mathis came into the interview room, and he had a very grim, annoyed look on his face. He threw down the artist's sketch of the humanoid ape in front of me. "You think this is funny?" he said, looking at me disdainfully. "What do you mean, officer?" I said. "That's the creature that I saw in the woods, the one that murdered the man." "Oh, really?" laughed the officer sarcastically. "You think I was born yesterday? Is this some kind of a sick joke of yours? Is this how you get your kicks, drawing fictitious monsters for police investigations? While I appreciate the fact that you brought the dismembered hand here to the station, I do not enjoy people who waste police time and valuable resources. This is a police investigation. It's not a joke, and it needs to be taken seriously. I find it very offensive that you are treating us this way." "But that is the creature that committed the murder," I protested. "I saw him in the woods, officer. I'm not making it up. I would never willingly waste police time. I assure you of that." Detective Mathis seemed to suddenly calm down. "Well, if that is the case," he said, "I do not know what you think you saw there in those woods, but you'll be glad to know that this crime of passion has been solved, and the murderer is now in custody, awaiting trial." "But, officer," I protested, "that monster I saw, I know it killed him." "Yes, I suppose you could describe him as a monster, in a manner of speaking," said Detective Mathis. "But he did not look like the monster you got the sketch artist to draw for us. He looked pretty average to me, like any man that you would see walking up and down the street in passing. That's the problem with murderers. They always look normal." Imagine my horror when I was to discover that the monster that I'd encountered in the woods had actually not been responsible for the murder of this man's dismembered body after all. The corpse was found partially buried in a shallow grave. It appeared that wild animals had been digging up the grave and eating some of the body parts, which is possibly why my dog found the dismembered hand. Officer Mathis told me that the murder happened because of a love triangle between two brothers who were both passionately in love with the very same woman. The younger brother was absolutely furious because his older brother was winning this woman's affection, and when she'd agreed to marry him, he became incensed and incandescent with rage. In a fit of jealous rage, the young brother decided to take out his competition by killing his brother vengefully, and had shot him at point-blank range using a lethal high-caliber rifle. Then he had frozen the body in his deep freezer and dismembered it with an electric saw and packed the parts in black bin liners and subsequently buried them in the woods. "Why those woods?" I asked. "There's so many hiking trails around there. Why would he not just bury his brother in some remote spot where his body could never be found? That's what I would do if I'd murdered someone. That's because you're smart and clever. But not all murderers are so discerning like you clearly are, chided Detective Mathis. I can see you're as bright as a button. I think our haughty, narcissistic murderer was lazy, arrogant and complacent, he continued. He never believed he would get caught. You know the type, full of his own condescending self-importance. The backyard of his house faces the park that you visit with your dogs. So all he needed to do was to climb over the fence in the middle of the night and bury the body there. The trouble was, in his haste, he got the job done rather too quickly. He didn't bury the body deep enough. If he had applied himself more carefully, no one would have suspected a thing, and he'd have got away with a grisly crime. It would seem that the grave was far too shallow, which was why the wild animals were unearthing it in the first place. They were drawn to the smell of a decaying corpse. It looks like a couple of coyotes had been eating and chewing up some of the body parts. That's why I imagine your dog retrieved the dismembered hand, which you thankfully brought to my station and presented to me on my desk in a way that I am not likely to ever forget. Do things like this rarely happen? I asked Officer Mathis. I mean, why would he kill his own brother just for the love of a woman? That's crazy. I mean, who does that? Murder their own flesh and blood? I mean, it's appalling. It's despicable. You'll be surprised how many murders I investigate that are closer to home than you could imagine. And in my experience, jealousy and envy play a pivotal role in many of my murder investigations.
Did he confess to the murder? I asked. I mean, the brother, I mean.
Oh, yes, he did. After a few beers, that garrulous man began to talk and talk and talk. I couldn't even stop him. You see, we have our ways of getting people to spill their guts. I've been doing this kind of work for over 20 years now. I know how to get people to talk, even if I have to engage more crafty methods in my approach. I remember walking away from that police station, hardly daring to believe that the monster that I'd seen in the woods had not been responsible for the heinous crime like I had perceived. So fast forward a few weeks, and I soon learnt that no one had experienced any strange encounters with the mysterious beast that I'd seen in the Sylvan. So I guess whatever he was, he must have been passing through that area. Fortunately, I was once again able to take my dogs back to the lake, but I have learnt this. If you notice the woods becoming menacingly quiet, I'd like to warn everybody who's listening to get out there as fast as you possibly can, because something is in there that you really don't want to encounter, and even the birds become sensitive to the presence of a predator or a monster. That I can assure you of. I quickly shut up about my encounter with the critter, because people think you're completely bonkers when you tell them you've seen something that sounds too spurious to actually be genuine. I only shared my harrowing account with Philippa, who believed my story emphatically, because she perceived how grievously evil the woods seemed on that day. All these years later, I know I encountered a Bigfoot, and if I never see the creature again, it'll be way too soon. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.